I try not to think about what could have happened too much. I've been heading into the bush alone for years now. Just a boat, a pack, a compass, and some paper maps, sticking to Crown land where no one's around to bug me. No rangers, no registration stations, no assigned fire pits or pit toilets. I don't go out there to socialize or play tourist. I go to get away, but sometimes getting away comes with a price. This happened about 4 years back, early June. Just early enough the bugs were out in full force, but late enough most of the meltwater was gone, and the rivers were back to manageable levels. I had plotted a 10-day loop that cut through a series of lakes and narrow channels along a forgotten strip of backcountry about 60 kilometers from the closest access road. It was a place I'd been eyeing for a while. A quiet stretch tucked behind a mess of overgrown portages and choke points too annoying for most weekenders to bother with. Getting in wasn't easy. 2 long paddle days upwind, and 3 portages with downed trees, half-rotten boards, and the kind of mud that swallows your boots if you hesitate for even a second. On day 3, I hit the first lake I'd planned to stay at for more than a night. The water there was glass, dead still, not a single ripple across the surface. Thick spruce and jack pine lined the shore in every direction. There were no signs of anyone. No cleared sites, no fire rings, no busted beer cans or fishing line left behind. I had the whole place to myself, exactly how I wanted it. The first few days passed easy. I fished in the mornings, cleaned my catch by late afternoon, and spent the evenings watching the sun drop low over the water. The bugs were bad, as they always are, but I kept them at bay with netting and smoke. I was running on my usual setup: cast iron pan, small stove, ultralight gear, and a bottle of bourbon that I'd been rationing pretty responsibly up to that point. It was the 5th night in when things went sideways. I caught a couple good pickerel just before sunset. I brought them back to shore and set up on a flat rock by the water, laying out the filleting knife and rinsing the fish in a bit of lake water. I had my bug net around my head but pulled it up just for a second to scratch my cheek, when a cloud of black flies instantly swarmed in. Without thinking, I went to swat them off my face, but I was still holding the knife. I didn't even feel it at first, just a dull thud against my cheekbone, then a warm trickle running down the side of my face. Took maybe 2 seconds to realize what I'd done. The blade had caught me right along the cheek, a deep 1-inch slash running from the edge of my eye down toward my jaw. I dropped the knife and stumbled back, nearly tripping into the water. Blood was already pooling down my chin, dripping onto the rock below. There's something about facial cuts, they bleed more than they should. I cupped a hand to my cheek, but the blood was already running between my fingers. The inside of my mouth tasted like iron, and I started to feel lightheaded. I sat down hard and pressed the heel of my palm against the gash, trying to slow it. All I could think about was how far I was from help. No phone, no radio, no GPS. Just my map, my compass, and a stretch of bush between me and civilization. I waited there for a few minutes, trying to get my breathing back under control. The cut stung, but the bleeding wasn't stopping on its own. I knew I had a first aid kit in my dry bag, but I also knew it wasn't going to be enough. A couple butterfly closures and gauze pads weren't going to seal this. It needed stitches. I don't know how long I sat there weighing my options. It must have been 20 minutes, maybe more. The sun was going down fast, and the mosquitoes had started coming in hard now that the black flies were backing off. My face was sticky with blood, and I could feel it drying along my neck. Eventually, I stood up, found my way back to the tent, and dug through my kit. I had fishing line, heavy, braided stuff I used for pike. I had a needle in my sewing kit used for patching gear, and I had half a fifth of bourbon left. I cleaned the needle as best I could with the bourbon, then splashed some over the cut. That part one remember very clearly. Felt like someone shoved a hot coal into my face. I doubled over and dry heaved into the dirt. Once the worst of the sting passed, I held the compass mirror in one hand and started the work. It wasn't pretty. My hands were shaking, and the mirror was too small to get a good angle, so I had to do most of it by feel. I pinched the skin together, pushed the needle through, pulled the line tight, and did it again. 8 passes in total. I tied it off with trembling fingers and poured the last bit of bourbon over the whole mess. Then I sat back and looked up at the stars. They were just starting to come out, barely visible through the tree canopy. I could feel my heartbeat pounding in my cheek, a deep, dull throb that didn't let up all night. I didn't sleep much. Every time I moved, the stitches tugged and pulled, sending sharp jolts through my face. By morning, the area was swollen, but it wasn't leaking pus or smelling bad, so I figured the bourbon had done its job. I decided to stay put another day and watch for signs of infection. The swelling didn't get worse. By the next night, the bleeding had stopped entirely. I took that as a good sign and packed up the next morning to start heading back. But I wasn't thinking clearly. I was tired, half dehydrated, and hadn't eaten properly in 2 days. That's when I capsized. It was a narrow channel connecting 2 lakes, fast water, lots of submerged rocks. I'd been through tighter spots before, but that day I was sluggish. My reaction time was off. I tried to thread through a gap between 2 boulders and misjudged the current. The bow swung wide, clipped a rock, and flipped me straight over. The water was freezing. Snow melt from the north side, probably. My pack was lashed down, but a few loose items went flying. One of my paddles, a stuffed sack, my hatchet. I scrambled back to the overturned canoe, flipped it upright with effort, and started hauling things in. My fingers were numb. I was soaked to the bone. The kicker? That was the only paddle I had. I never brought a spare. Dumb mistake, I know. I floated there for a while, bobbing in the water like a fool, clutching the side of the canoe, trying to figure out what to do. Eventually, I found a long, straight branch in the shallows and broke off the limbs. It wasn't a great paddle, but it worked well enough to get me to the next portage. By the time I reached the halfway point back to the truck, I was in rough shape. My cheek was healing, but I hadn't been eating right. I'd lost my knife in the capsize, so cleaning fish was out. I was down to oatmeal, jerky, and a few protein bars. That and the bugs, God, the bugs were relentless. They found the dried blood around the stitches and wouldn't leave me alone. But I kept pushing. I didn't have another option. I had one more scare on day 8, raccoons. Or maybe a bear. I never saw it. I'd made camp near the edge of a small creek, a place I thought was quiet and safe. Around midnight, I heard rustling near my tarp, then the unmistakable sound of gear being dragged. I jumped up, half asleep, grabbed my flashlight and stumbled out barefoot. My food barrel was on its side, the lid clawed open. Whatever it was had already bolted by the time I got there. I found muddy prints along the bank the next morning. Too small for a bear. Must have been raccoons. They got away with 2 of my last bars and half a bag of dried fruit. I tied what little I had left up in a tree that night and didn't sleep more than an hour. On day 10, I hit the access road. Just an old logging route, barely wide enough for a truck. My car was still where I left it, dusty and covered in pine needles. I dropped my pack, climbed into the seat, and sat there in silence for almost 10 minutes before I even turned the key. When I looked in the mirror, the stitched cut along my face had started to scab. It would leave a scar, I knew that already, but it could have been my eye, could have been an artery, could have been the kind of thing that left me bleeding out on the rocks, alone and without help. I've done a dozen trips since then, always solo, always out there as far as I can get. But now I carry a spare paddle, a real suture kit, and a few extra ounces of whiskey, just in case. Because out there, one dumb mistake doesn't wait for a rescue. It just waits. My parents had left early Friday morning for the weekend. They'd planned a quick camping trip in the mountains about 3 hours away, a tradition they did every year to escape the city noise. They wanted us kids, my 2 younger sisters and me, to stay home alone. I was 16, my sisters 12 and 8. We'd done this before, but this time something felt off, though I didn't understand it at first. Before leaving, Mom and Dad reminded us to keep the doors locked, not to answer the phone if we didn't know who it was, and to stick together. They were careful to mention that the neighborhood was usually quiet, but lately, there had been a few reports of strange people lurking around at night. Nothing concrete, they said, just rumors. We had the house to ourselves. A typical 2-story with a small yard fenced in by a wooden gate. It wasn't a big house, but comfortable enough. The living room had a big window facing the street, with a couch and a TV. We had our phones and tablets, but since the Wi-Fi was spotty, we mostly entertained ourselves with movies and snacks. Saturday morning was bright and warm. The sun streamed through the kitchen window as I poured cereal for my sisters. They were still half asleep but hungry. The house was quiet except for the usual creaks and groans old houses make when they warm up. At exactly 9 a.m., the phone rang. None of us moved at first. It was the landline. It wasn't common to get calls on it anymore, so we ignored it. The ringing stopped after a few seconds. But then the phone rang again a minute later, and this time the answering machine clicked on, recording the message. We all stopped what we were doing and looked at each other. Finally, my oldest sister, Sarah, said, "Maybe we should listen to it." We gathered in the living room, sitting close on the couch. The tape played. "I am the Viper. I know where you live. I'm coming to your house today." The voice was deep, calm, but had a cold edge to it. It didn't sound like any of our friends, or even a kid playing a prank. It sounded like an adult man, and something about the voice sent a shiver down my spine. I rewound the tape and listened again, trying to catch any background noise or clues. Nothing. No laughter, no music, just that chilling voice. The sisters looked scared. I felt my heart beating faster but tried to stay calm. Maybe it was some twisted prank. I thought about calling my parents, but their phones went straight to voicemail. They were camping and probably had no signal. An hour passed. We tried to distract ourselves with cartoons, snacks, and cleaning up the kitchen, but the tension grew heavier with each minute. Then the phone rang again. I jumped. The answering machine clicked on again, and the tape started spinning. The voice returned. "I am the Viper. I'm 2 hours away." I looked at my sisters. They looked pale. I tried to keep my voice steady but couldn't stop the slight tremble. Another hour went by, and the calls kept coming, always with the voice of the Viper saying he was getting closer. "I am the Viper and I'm 1 hour away. You better close all the windows." That last message sent me into action. I got up and started closing every window in the house, pulling the curtains tight and locking all the doors again. I gathered the kitchen knives, some heavy wooden spoons, even a baseball bat my dad kept in the closet. I tried not to think about what I'd do if someone really showed up. The next message came faster. The tape word as the voice said, "I am the Viper, and I'm in your neighborhood." My youngest sister clung to me, trembling. The fear we all felt was like a thick fog settling over the house. I barricaded the front door with a heavy chair and wedged a broom handle under the doorknob. I looked through the peephole but didn't see anyone. The street was empty, quiet except for a few birds chirping and distant cars. The tape played again. A new message. "I am the Viper, and I'm on your street." I could hardly breathe. It was getting darker outside now. The sun was dipping behind the trees, the shadows growing longer. We huddled together in the living room, surrounded by whatever weapons we could find. The air felt thick with fear and anticipation. Suddenly, a loud knock came at the front door. My heart stopped. The three of us froze, staring at the door. The knocking came again, louder and more urgent. I swallowed hard and stepped forward, gripping the bat tightly. I looked through the peephole and saw a man standing there. I couldn't make out his face clearly because of the fading light, but he looked ordinary enough, wearing a plain jacket and jeans. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. Who is it? Are you the Viper?" I said out loud, my voice shaking. The man laughed, a surprisingly cheerful, almost mocking laugh, and said in a bright, playful tone, "Yes, I'm the Viper, and I'm here to vipe the windows." I blinked, confused. Then the man pulled out a spray bottle and a cloth from his bag and started wiping the window. I realized then that the Viper was just a window cleaner, a man who had been hired by my parents to clean the house windows while they were away. He had called to announce his arrival, but somehow, maybe through a prank or a misunderstanding, had left those strange messages on our answering machine. Relief flooded me, but it took a long moment for the tension to fully leave my body. I unlocked the door and let the man in to clean the windows. My sisters and I stayed close but tried to act normal. The man worked quietly, chatting briefly about the weather and his job. Nothing about the threatening messages. After he left, I checked the phone again. No more calls. Later, when my parents returned, I told them everything. They apologized for not warning us properly and for the confusion. They said the window cleaner liked to joke around, but they hadn't expected this. I spent the rest of that weekend thinking about fear, how it can twist things in your mind, how it can make even the most ordinary events seem terrifying. That night, when I finally fell asleep, I realized the house was safe. We were safe, and sometimes fear was just a story your mind told itself. It had been nearly 10 years since we first started doing our annual backcountry canoe trips, and despite the misery that always found its way into the experience, we kept coming back. I think it was partly out of tradition and partly out of stubbornness. My best friend and I had known each other since we were kids, and over the years we'd looped his wife and my younger brother into this madness. This time, we'd chosen Algonquin Park again, a place that always managed to remind us that nature doesn't give a damn about your plans. The trip started like most of them do. 2 vehicles, both older than they should be for the kind of driving we were doing. We crammed our gear into every inch of space. Tents, packs, food barrels, paddles, dry bags, which never stayed dry, sleeping bags, stove, and a bare rope we never tied properly. It was early September, just after the Labor Day weekend rush. We figured we'd catch the tail end of summer without the crowds, and maybe even some late warmth. That was a mistake. We arrived at the access point just after noon. The sky was already gray. The clouds sat heavy over the treetops, and you could smell the damp on the wind before the rain even started. We had a good 10 kilometers of paddling ahead of us before our first sight, including 2 short portages. Everyone was still in that early trip good mood, the kind where you're tired but still pretending not to be, and we got on the water quick. The first day's rain came gentle but steady, just enough to soak through the shoulders of our shirts and the knees of our pants. There's a particular kind of cold that seeps in slowly. You don't feel it all at once, but by the time you're hauling a canoe up a muddy slope and your boot sinks knee-deep into a puddle that shouldn't exist, it hits you all at once. That was the mood by mid-afternoon. Cold, wet, and tired. The water in the lakes was warmer than the air by that point, and more than once I thought about just jumping in. We set up camp on a sloped piece of ground that would have been manageable if it wasn't already soaked through. The tent pegs barely held. I barely remember what we ate that night, but I know it was something boiled. Boiled pasta, boiled rice. Everything was always boiled. The fire we managed to get going was pitiful, but it was fire. We huddled around it in rain jackets that smelled like sweat and mildew, and the steam off our bodies mixed with the smoke until we couldn't see each other anymore. That night it rained hard. The kind of rain that makes it feel like the forest is collapsing in on itself. I remember waking up in the middle of the night and feeling the sleeping bag under me squish like a wet sponge. The bottom of the tent had become a kiddie pool. I just laid there for a long time, listening to the hiss of water on nylon, the wind in the trees, and my brother snoring through it all like it was nothing. The second day was more of the same. Gray skies, mist, and everything soaked. We made it through 2 more lakes, each feeling bigger and colder than the last. The paddling was slow, and the water clung to our sleeves every time we dipped the paddles. My fingers got so cold I couldn't feel the blisters forming until they split. We tried to dry socks by the fire that night, but they just ended up warm and wet instead of cold and wet. The only time we got a break from it all was day 3. That was the day we had the long portage, 2 kilometers of winding trail through forest and swamp. That morning, the sun came up bright and blinding, like the sky was apologizing for everything else. No clouds, just pure blue. But of course, it had to be the day we had the worst portage. We loaded up like pack animals. Each of us took 2 loads, one with the canoe, one with barrels and bags. The heat came up fast, and the air got thick. It felt like you were trying to breathe through a wet towel. By the time we were halfway through, my shirt was plastered to my back, and I could feel the salt stinging the cuts on my hands. I remember my brother slipping on a wet root and face planting into the mud, barrel and all. No one laughed. We were too tired. He just lay there for a minute, face down, breathing heavy, before getting back up and dragging himself forward. It felt like we were all marching through some slow-motion version of hell. But that was the day we rigged up the sail. We had a big tarp that we usually used for cooking shelter, and after some trial and error, we tied it to 2 paddles and stuck them up in the front of the canoe. The wind caught it perfectly. For a few hours, we just sat back and let it carry us down the lake, the air drying our shirts and faces. It was the first time on that trip that I felt almost human again. The water sparkled, the breeze cooled our skin, and the forest around us finally looked less like something trying to kill us. That didn't last. That night it rained again, worse than before. We woke up to rivers running under the tents, gear floating in puddles, socks that smelled like rot, and the sound of mice gnawing at the food barrel. There's a special kind of frustration that comes when you know you still have 2 days left and everything you own is soaked and moldy. We made the decision to pull out a day early. There was no drying anything. Fires didn't stay lit. Our feet were blistered and raw from wet boots, and my brother had a rash on his legs that was starting to look more like a medical problem than a camping inconvenience. The only day it didn't rain was the one that tried to melt us alive, and none of us wanted to see what was coming next. The last stretch back was rough. One of the canoes took on water after we hit a submerged rock, and we had to bail like crazy to keep it above water. The wind turned against us. Paddling into it felt like trying to push a wall uphill. Our arms were noodles by the time we hit the access point, but we were back on land, and that was enough. We loaded the gear back into the vehicles. My buddy had borrowed his dad's old van, a real rust bucket from the 90s that sounded like a lawnmower on a good day. I had my truck, an old Ford F100 with no back seat and a gear shifter that stuck between second and third if you didn't baby it just right. We hit the road, half asleep and running on beef jerky and water that tasted like lake bottom. We stopped about an hour later at a small gas station restaurant combo out near Dwight. One of those places that looks abandoned even when it's open. We were filling up when smoke started pouring from under the hood of the van. At first, we thought it was just steam. It had been running hot the whole trip, but then came the flames. They were small at first, licking up around the front grille like they were just testing the air. I don't think anyone said anything. We all just moved. I ran for the fire extinguisher mounted on the pump. I yanked it free, pulled the pin, and squeezed the handle. Nothing. Just a dead hiss and a burst of yellow powder that didn't go more than 6 inches. Empty. The fire was climbing now, popping and hissing under the hood like a kettle about to blow. I took off running into the restaurant, nearly slipping on the tile floor. I didn't ask. I just grabbed the big red extinguisher hanging by the kitchen door and sprinted back outside. By the time I got there, the plastic under the hood was bubbling. I let loose with the extinguisher and got lucky. The fire died with one final belch of black smoke. That should have been the end of it. We were shaken, dirty, and more tired than I've ever been. But of course, the guy who ran the place came storming out. He started shouting, pointing at the extinguisher, screaming about who was going to pay for it. He was red-faced, sweat pouring down his neck like he'd just run a marathon. I could barely process it. Something inside me snapped. I don't remember everything. I remember stepping toward him. I remember my brother grabbing my arm. I remember my friend's wife yelling something behind me. And I remember saying something about suing his ass for having empty safety equipment at the pumps. That part came out real clear. It got loud. Too loud. But no one hit anyone. And after a lot of shouting, we stormed off. We couldn't even drive the van anymore. The wires under the dash had melted. So we shoved everything we could into my truck. For people, soaking gear, and no space. My brother sat on a cooler between the seats. My friend's wife sat half on his lap, half against the window. No one spoke much after that. We still had 3 hours to go. I drove the whole way, arms locked on the wheel, sweat running down my back even though the windows were down. The gears stuck every time I shifted. My leg cramped up from working the clutch, and the cab smelled like wet clothes, engine grease, and burned plastic. We didn't stop until we pulled into my buddy's driveway. Everyone spilled out like we just crawled out of a trench. No celebration, no handshakes, Just silence and the sound of 4 people realizing that the only good part of the trip was that it was finally over. That was a long time ago now, but every time we talk about it, me, my buddy, his wife, and my brother, we laugh harder than we should. Not because it was fun. It wasn't. It was miserable from start to finish. But because we got through it. Because the van didn't explode. Because no one drowned. Because somehow we still keep going back. Algonquin chewed us up and spit us out that year. But part of me knows we'll be back again. Probably with better rain gear. Maybe with a backup fire extinguisher. But the same old stubborn need to prove that we can take whatever the woods throw at us. Even when the woods win. I don't think I've ever wanted something as badly as I wanted to get that canoe out on the water after the long winter. We bought it late the previous summer while passing through some backroad town in southern British Columbia. It was sitting on the front lawn of a corner lot with a faded for sale sign stuck to its cheap plastic hull. $400. That's what the guy wanted for it, and looking back now, that should have told us everything we needed to know. But at the time, we were just wide-eyed and excited, new to canoeing, new to the idea of gliding over water like explorers. Our gear tucked inside, the bow slicing through morning mist on an untouched mountain lake. The canoe was an absolute tank, about 14 feet long and maybe 60 kilograms of raw plastic, dull red like a kid's sled, almost cartoonish. It felt like it had been made for backyard ponds or amusement parks. It had no keel, barely any rocker, and the hull flexed if you pressed it with your thumb. We didn't know any of that back then. We just saw our canoe. We used it a handful of times that fall close to shore, sticking to small lakes around the Okanagan. Those early paddles were calm, safe, and warm. We'd crack a beer, let the wind drift us back to the dock, and talk about how this was going to be our lifestyle. We named her Pinky, half a joke, half a promise. All through winter we obsessed. We read books about paddling technique. We watched videos on the J-stroke and pry and draw and cross-draw until we felt like we could teach a course. We sketched out plans for a long road trip that would take us north to the wild lakes of British Columbia. Lakes with names we couldn't pronounce but could already picture ourselves camped beside. And when spring finally showed itself, warm and early, we jumped on it. That day in particular was one of those false start spring days. Sunny, light breeze, air warm enough that we left the jackets behind and packed like it was early summer. We loaded Pinky onto the car with pool noodles and ratchet straps and took off toward Okanagan Lake. We had no route, no agenda. We just wanted to be out there again, floating, free, finally in motion. Okanagan Lake is huge, over 130 kilometers long, and deep enough in places that you'd need special equipment to touch bottom. It has a reputation for being calm one minute and raging the next, but we weren't thinking about any of that. To us, it was just a big blue playground. We picked a small turnoff near a sparsely used campground, parked the car, and hauled the canoe and gear down to a gravel beach. The sun was out in full, reflecting off the lake in that blinding, silvery way that makes you feel like you're in a postcard. I cracked a beer while we set up camp. Our sleeping bags were tossed inside the tent, cooler stashed in some shade, and the fire pit was clean and ready for use. It all felt so easy. When we launched, we didn't go far, maybe a few hundred meters offshore. Life vests were on, but unzipped and loose. Our gear was jammed under the seats and wedged near the stern, dry bags, extra beer, snacks, a towel, boots, even my phone with a cracked screen inside one of those dry bags that had never been tested properly. The water felt cold on the paddle blade, but not dangerously so. We figured we'd do a lap along the shoreline and drift back. We weren't planning to be far out. Then came the clouds. They weren't dramatic at first, just some light gray streaks that broke up the blue. I noticed them before my partner did, and my first thought was that it was weird how fast they seemed to appear. The wind shifted too, a subtle push that made the canoe start to drift even as we weren't paddling. We were just finishing our second beer when a snowflake landed square on my wrist. Caught my attention immediately because it didn't belong there. It was still warm on the beach, still calm only seconds earlier. I looked up and saw another flake drop, then another. Within maybe 30 seconds, the breeze turned into a gust. It didn't build, it hit. sudden and sharp, like someone had turned a giant fan on full blast up the valley. We sat up, stashed the cans, and gripped our paddles, trying to make headway toward shore. The wind was now coming in sideways, blowing whitecaps across the surface of the lake like marching lines. Every stroke felt like we were trying to dig our way through wet cement. Then the rail hit came, a massive rolling swell that lifted the canoe from the rear and snapped it sideways. The next wave hit broadside and flipped us so violently that I remember seeing both my knees and the bottom of the boat at the same time. We didn't capsize in the way you'd expect. Slowly tipping, a scramble to brace. We got slapped out of the canoe, just gone. The cold punched into me with a kind of violence I can't explain. It wasn't pain at first, more like my body refusing to process what was happening. I gasped on instinct and sucked down water. The life vest kept me upright, but I still felt like I was sinking. My limbs didn't respond properly. Everything in me shrank and locked up. I looked around in a panic. The canoe was floating nose up, tail down, vertical in the water like it had snapped in half and sunk on one side. All our gear was trapped inside, pinned under the seats or caught under the thwart, and sinking slowly with it. Only the smallest part of the bow, maybe 2 inches, was poking up above the water. We clipped up our vests, something we should have done 10 minutes earlier. We kicked backward, keeping our heads above water, toward shore. I don't know how far it was, maybe 20 or 30 meters. Felt like forever. The beach was gone behind us, replaced by tall lakeside houses, all silent and empty looking. We scrambled up onto a dock, dripping, shivering, barefoot, soaked through every layer. No one came out, no curtains moved. Felt like we'd broken into a movie set of fake houses. We stripped down to underwear and laid our clothes out in the sun. Our hands were shaking uncontrollably, the start of real hypothermia. I don't remember saying anything. We just sat there, knees to chest, waiting for warmth to crawl back into us. We stared at the lake, watching the canoe drift away. No chance we were getting it. The wind was calmer now, but it had done its damage. I had no phone. It was in that junk dry bag, which now lay 30 feet down inside a flooded canoe. We had no shoes, no towels. One of my boots was already gone. All we had was the pair of underwear we were drying out in. It was maybe 2 p.m., but it felt like early evening already. We started walking barefoot along the shore, sticking to the narrow band of dry grass and rock between the lake and the fences. Every rock felt like glass. My heels were raw by the time we found a game trail that veered back into the woods. The forest trail was just dirt and pine needles for the first few meters. Then it turned to thorns and gravel. Every step was slow and stupid. I didn't even know if we were headed the right way. The trees closed in quickly and the sun faded behind them. The cold never really left. It sat inside my chest like a frozen knot. Somehow, after what must have been over an hour, we reached the campsite. The tent was there, fire pit untouched, everything dry and exactly as we'd left it. I dove into the car and cranked the heat. The vents roared like a jet engine and the warmth felt like a resurrection. I remember the feeling of blood coming back into my toes and how it felt worse than the cold. We weren't thinking clearly, that was obvious, but we also weren't sure what to do next. The gear was gone. The canoe was gone. We needed shoes badly, because there was snow in the forecast and we had to cross the Coquihalla to get home. One blizzard, one flat tire, and we'd be finished. We decided that she would go for help or find some kind of store or even knock on a door. Her phone was waterproof and clipped to her belt. I'd stay behind and dry out the rest of our gear, try to make a fire. There were people in the campground. I figured if anything else went sideways, I'd yell. I had just started the fire when a car came down the gravel road and slowed. A woman leaned out, yelling something. At first, I couldn't process the words. My brain was still foggy. Then I heard it clearly. Anyone fall out of a pink canoe? Couldn't believe it. She told me that her husband had spotted a bright object bobbing slowly along the shoreline near their property, a few kilometers north. She'd heard about it from a neighbor and came looking. She offered me a ride. I took it without thinking. She borrowed a kayak from another neighbor. I climbed in, arms still sore from the earlier panic, and paddled out. The canoe was still nose up, gently rocking, like a scolded dog trying to hide its head. I looped a rope around the bow and towed it in slow, careful inches back to the dock. Took forever, but I got it. Almost everything was still in it, wet but present. My phone, the towel, the speaker, clothes, dry bags that had held nothing dry. All there, all but one boot which we never found. The woman gave me a plastic bag full of rice for the phone. She made me a sandwich and gave me a beer. We laughed a bit, and I sat at her kitchen table like some drowned cat, trying not to cry or laugh or vomit. When my phone flickered back to life, I texted my partner, who must have nearly fallen over when she saw the message. "Got the canoe. Come back." We left Pinky tied to her dock and picked it up the next morning. The rest of the week, we stayed in camp and didn't paddle. I want to tell you about something my father told me once. It's not just any story. It's one that his brother lived through when they were kids. I've asked my uncles separately, and they all tell the exact same thing without any changes or exaggerations. It's one of those stories that sticks with you because it feels too real to be anything else. My family comes from a small town in Mexico, the kind of place where everyone knows each other. This town is known for its history with brujeria, witchcraft. Not the Hollywood kind, but real old traditions and whispers people say run deep in the area. The kind of place where strange things sometimes happen, but no one talks about it openly. At least not without a bit of fear. My father and his brothers grew up there, right next to their grandmother's house. Their place was just on the other side of a small river gorge. Most of the year, the river was almost dry, just a narrow rocky ditch cutting between the two houses. It was easy for the kids to cross back and forth, running across the stones or jumping from rock to rock. One afternoon, my father and his brothers went across the gorge to their grandmother's to eat lunch. The day was bright but quiet. The dry riverbed below looked cracked, the sun beating down on the dust and rocks, casting long shadows from the trees nearby. Their youngest brother, Jocelo, was left behind napping in their own house. The others left him there because they figured he'd be fine and didn't want to wake him. But when Jocelo finally woke up, the house felt wrong. It was deathly quiet, the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. There were no sounds of birds, no wind, nothing but stillness hanging in the air. He said he got up to find their mom because something felt off. As he walked into the bedroom, he noticed the long mirror standing by the wall. And that's when he saw her. In the reflection, there was a woman standing behind him, or at least it seemed that way. She was combing her hair slowly, calmly, but when Jocelo looked directly into the room, she wasn't there. No one was. Just the empty bedroom with its cracked walls and faded curtains moving slightly in the still air. The mirror showed her clearly, though. Long black hair hanging down, moving as she combed it methodically, and her eyes fixed somewhere far away, like she wasn't seeing him. A deep, cold feeling settled into Jocelo's chest. A heavy dread that made his throat close up and his hands shake. Without thinking, he started screaming. The kind of scream that tears through your body and makes your voice raw. And then he began to cry uncontrollably. His brothers, who were still at their grandmother's house across the gorge, heard his screams echo through the dry riverbed. They didn't hesitate. They ran back as fast as they could, their feet kicking up dust and loose stones as they crossed the rocky gorge. The eldest brother, Mayo, was the first to reach the house. He opened the door, and at that moment, a massive bird burst out of the house, flying low and fast into the sky. It was huge. Jocelo said it looked like an enormous hawk or maybe a buzzard, with dark feathers and sharp eyes. It startled everyone. When they found Jocelo inside, he was shaking, frozen in place, his face pale and eyes wild with fear. He couldn't calm down. He was inconsolable for days. My father says Jocelo never fully explained what he felt or saw beyond the mirror, just that it was like looking death straight in the eye. What's strange is that my dad, who is usually the jokester in our family, tells the story without any smiles or laughs. His voice drops, and he gets serious, almost like he's trying to understand it himself. He clearly believes what Jocelo experienced, and so do I. There are plenty of weird things that happen in that town. My great-aunt's house, for example, is infamous for being haunted, or at least that's what everyone says. But it's all in a quiet way, not like those wild ghost stories. People just feel uneasy there sometimes. Now, I want to tell you everything as clearly and as carefully as I can about what happened that day, because it's more than just a scary story. It's a glimpse into something deeper about fear, family, and the kind of things that people see but don't always want to talk about. The town itself is small, tucked away in a valley surrounded by dry hills and sparse trees. The air is hot and dusty most of the year, with a few brief rainy seasons that bring the river to life. The houses are simple, made from stone or adobe, painted in faded colors that peel in the sun. People live close together, mostly farmers and small shopkeepers. Life moves slowly, and traditions run deep. Stories about witches and brujas have been passed down for generations, whispered mostly at night or when adults want to warn kids not to wander too far. These aren't ghost stories or fairy tales. They're stories about real people who use old, strange knowledge to influence things, sometimes to help, sometimes to harm. My father and his brothers grew up in this world. Their house was right next to their grandmother's, separated only by that river gorge, which was more like a cracked scar running through the earth than a flowing river most of the year. Crossing between the two houses was easy, but the space between felt like a line you didn't cross lightly. The gorge was rocky, dry, and dusty, with sharp stones scattered where the water would sometimes rush in the wet season. It was a place kids ran through daily, laughing and chasing each other. But on some days, especially quiet ones, the gorge seemed like a barrier between two worlds. It was one of those quiet afternoons when my father and his brothers went to their grandmother's house for lunch. They had all eaten there many times before, and it was a familiar routine. Their youngest brother, Joselo, was left behind to nap because he wasn't feeling well. The others thought he'd be fine alone for a little while. The air was still, the sun hot, and even the usual sounds of birds and insects were missing. The dry riverbed beneath their feet felt cracked and lifeless, as if something had sucked the life out of the whole place. My father remembers the silence being so heavy that it pressed down on their ears. At the grandmother's house, they talked quietly, not paying much attention to the strange quiet outside. But then came the screams. Joselo's voice cut through the stillness like a knife. It was full of terror, loud, desperate, filled with a kind of pain that grabbed at their hearts. They dropped everything and ran back across the gorge, their feet pounding the stones, their breaths short and sharp. When they got to the house, Mayo was the first to reach the door. He opened it, and that's when the bird flew out, huge, dark, with wide wings beating the air fast as it disappeared into the sky. Inside, Joselo was shaking. His eyes were wild, filled with fear. He couldn't stop crying. For days, he wouldn't talk much, just stared off into space like he was haunted by something no one else could see. Joselo said he saw a woman in the mirror in their bedroom, not standing in the room, but reflected in the mirror. She was combing her hair slowly, but when Joselo turned around, there was no one there. The feeling of dread that came over him was like nothing he'd ever felt before. It was like his body knew something terrible was there, even if his eyes couldn't find it. No one in the family ever figured out what that woman meant or why the bird flew out the door. It was like a moment out of time, something dark and strange breaking through the ordinary world. Joselo's fear didn't go away quickly. He stayed on edge for days, unable to calm down. My father says he remembers his brother being pale and quiet, eyes darting around like he was always watching for something no one else could see. Over time, things returned to normal on the surface, but the memory stayed with the family. It was the kind of experience that leaves a mark, something you carry quietly and don't easily explain. I don't want to say it was anything supernatural. I want to believe it was just a strange, scary moment caused by something natural. Maybe a trick of light in the mirror, maybe the bird was nesting in the house, maybe Joselo was having a nightmare that spilled into waking life. But the way my father tells it, serious and quiet, makes me think there's more to it. The town itself holds secrets, and maybe that day, Joselo saw a glimpse of something hidden under the surface. Maybe it was the town's history, the weight of old stories pressing down, or the way the silence settled like a blanket over the houses. Maybe it was fear itself, real and raw, made visible in that mirror. This story has stayed with me because it feels honest. No wild ghosts or monsters, just a boy, a mirror, and a terrible feeling that something was wrong. The bird flying out was like the last piece. Strange, sudden, impossible to explain. My father still thinks about that day, and so do I. Sometimes, when I think about small towns like theirs, and how quiet the world can get on hot afternoons, I wonder what I'd see if I looked long enough into a mirror. Would I find something watching me? Something I couldn't understand? That's what scares me. Not ghosts or witches, but the unknown moments when the world feels different, darker, and you realize there are things just beyond your sight. And that's the story of Joselo, my uncle, and the day the house fell silent. I've done a lot of river trips over the years. Some were peaceful, a few were challenging, but most ended with beer and stories, not silence and trauma. This one, though, the one down south, that's the trip that still lives inside my head whether I want it to or not. I've never told the full version of it before, not to anyone. I kept my mouth shut because the truth is hard, and people wouldn't believe it even if I said it plainly. But here it is now, all of it. No dressing it up. It started with a plan that looked simple on paper. 4 of us, 2 canoes, a couple nights on a mild southern river. Nothing extreme, nothing technical. We were all city guys from up north, but we had some experience. A couple decent overnight trips under our belts, some decent paddling hours, and enough outdoor gear to look the part. It wasn't our first rodeo. The crew was me, Ed, Bobby, and Dave. Ed and I had known each other since college. Both of us worked in finance. Bobby was a nurse. Tough guy, not loud but always the one patching up the scrapes. Dave was the most athletic of us, always biking or running, kind of a health nut, but a good hang when it mattered. We self-outfitted the whole trip. No guides, no rented gear. We had 2 solid canoes, aluminum frames, well-maintained. Dry bags loaded with supplies, freeze-dried meals, a portable stove, first aid kits, water filters, and sleeping gear. We had 2 rifles packed too, more out of habit than necessity. This wasn't bear country, and we weren't planning to hunt. It was just for comfort, I guess, like insurance. You bring it and hope you don't need it. We left 1 vehicle at the takeout spot downstream, parked it off a dirt road beside a worn trailhead. Didn't look like anyone had been there in weeks, maybe longer. After hiding the key in the wheel well and double-checking it was locked, we piled into the second car and drove upstream to the put-in. The place had a weird feel to it the moment we arrived. Quiet, too quiet, and the kind of quiet that doesn't feel peaceful. It feels heavy, like the trees are listening. There were a couple locals fishing off the banks when we showed up. Middle-aged, rough-looking guys. Dirty ball caps, torn shirts, and the kind of faces that looked like they'd been outdoors every day for years. I gave a casual wave, tried to make a little small talk, but they didn't give much back. One of them just stared. Not angry or curious, just empty. It rattled me a bit, and Ed picked up on it too. After we got the canoes unloaded, he leaned over and muttered something about hoping our car would still be there in a few days. I kind of laughed it off, but we both felt it. That unease. But what could we do? Turn around? Call it off? We were already there. A few awkward locals weren't going to ruin our trip. So we shrugged it off, shoved off into the current, and started paddling. The river was calm, narrow in some stretches, wider in others, winding through thick trees that seemed to close in over us like a tunnel in places. We moved slow, mostly just letting the current carry us. There were occasional eddies and debris, but nothing tricky. The first day passed mostly uneventfully. We paddled, joked, took turns up front. After a few hours, the lead boat, Ed and Bobby, got ahead of us. Nothing unusual, we were all sort of loosely spaced out. Dave and I stopped to refill our water bottles from the filter, take a leak, and stretch our legs. By the time we caught up to them again, they were already back in their boat, sitting dead still in the water just off the shore. I saw their faces first, pale, blank. I could tell immediately something was off. We paddled alongside, and that's when Ed told us what happened. He said they'd pulled off for a snack break. Bobby stepped into the bushes to take a leak while Ed sat on a rock eating a protein bar. That's when two men came out of the woods. Not hikers, not campers, these were hunters. Shotguns slung over their shoulders. Dirty, wild-looking. One of them pointed his gun at Ed, told him not to move. The other one grabbed Bobby before he could even zip up. Then things got worse. The guy with the bad teeth pulled Bobby to the ground and, there's no polite way to say it, assaulted him. Told him to squeal like a pig. Ed said he was frozen, trying not to move, but the other guy started getting off on it, watching. Got distracted. That's when Ed saw his shot. He lunged, grabbed the shotgun, wrestled it away, and fired. First shot hit the guy who was standing, dead. The other guy pulled up his pants and tried to run. Ed fired again, hitting him in the shoulder, maybe worse. He stumbled into the woods bleeding, but gone. When we heard the shots, Dave and I had been only a few hundred yards downstream. We paddled back like hell. When we got there, Bobby was curled up on the shore, shaking. Ed was standing over the body. No one knew what to say. We were all just trying to process it. We didn't call the cops. We didn't report it. We didn't do anything a rational person might do because out there it didn't feel like we were in the world anymore. It felt like we were somewhere else, a place where the rules didn't apply. We dug a shallow grave off the riverbank, covered the body with rocks and dirt, and said nothing. Bobby didn't talk. Not then, not later. He just climbed into the boat, stared straight ahead, and drifted. We paddled a little longer that day before stopping to camp. Nobody spoke much. I cooked dinner without thinking. Just muscle memory. Pasta in a bag. Ed collected wood. Dave checked our supplies. Bobby laid in his tent and didn't move. The stars came out and the river went quiet again. But that quiet didn't feel peaceful anymore. Felt like something was waiting. Next morning, we got moving early. Nobody had slept. Bobby looked like he hadn't blinked all night. Ed was on edge, scanning the treeline constantly. Dave kept paddling harder than he needed to, like he could outpace the past 24 hours. Then came the rapid. Wasn't on the map, at least not marked as anything serious. But it had rained a few days earlier and the river was higher than usual. What looked like a ripple on the topo map turned into a nasty stretch of whitewater. We approached slowly, trying to line up our entry. Just as we were about to go in, I heard it. A sharp pop, not a crack against a rock. This was sharper. Then Dave fell backward, arms limp, out of the boat. He didn't surface. Everything spun out of control after that. The canoe tipped. I went under, swallowing a lungful of river water. I came up just in time to see Ed's canoe flip too. Bobby was floating downstream, clinging to the side of his boat. I dragged myself to shore, coughing, scraped up and cold. The others followed, but Dave was gone. We waited, looked, called his name. Nothing. Ed, bleeding from a cut on his eyebrow, started pacing. "That wasn't a rock," he said. "That was a gunshot." I wanted to argue, but he said it so certainly I stopped myself. I looked up at the ridge above the rapid. High ground, trees, thick brush. Perfect place for someone to wait, to watch. We were shaken, wet, missing gear, and Dave possibly dead. We didn't know if he drowned or if he'd been shot and dragged away by the current. Ed said he was going up, to check, to get eyes on the ridge. He left his canoe and climbed. It was maybe 40 minutes later when I heard the shot. A single echo from up high, then silence. Another 10 minutes passed and something splashed into the water. I waited out, heart pounding, expecting to find Ed. But it wasn't. It was the other hunter. The one Ed had shot yesterday. The one who ran. Now he was dead. Bullet to the face. I dragged the body to shore. Bobby helped. Neither of us said a word. Just looked at each other. Numb. We gathered rocks and weighted the man down. Sunk him in the pool below the rapid. It came back down a while later. Pale. Limping. Said he tripped and his own knife stabbed into his thigh. We bandaged it the best we could, using clean t-shirts and medical tape. He was lucky it missed anything vital, but he wasn't walking right. We told him we found the hunter and sunk him. He nodded and said we'd need to do the same with Dave if we found him. Too many questions. was all he said, and he wasn't wrong. We got back in the canoes. Bobby and I in one, Ed alone in the other. Nobody said a word. The river turned slow again, wide and lazy. Felt like the kind of stretch you'd enjoy on any normal trip. But everything felt hollow now. We found Dave an hour later, caught in a fallen tree, face down, shirt torn, arms limp. No way to be sure if it was a gunshot or just the river that got him. But his head was bruised, and blood had soaked through the back of his shirt. Maybe it was a bullet. Maybe it was just the rocks. We dragged him out, wrapped him in the rainfly from Ed's tent. Then we took him to a deeper pool and let him sink slowly, the rocks holding him down. 10 feet deep, maybe more. I watched his shape disappear into the murk, and for a second, I thought I'd feel something: grief, anger, horror. But there was nothing left in me. Just empty. It was late by then, but none of us wanted to camp. We'd been planning the Allagash trip for almost 4 months. 8 of us total, some close friends, others acquaintances from mutual connections or previous weekend hikes. No one was a professional guide, but I had the most backcountry experience, so I ended up taking point. That was fine with me. I liked the structure of planning, mapping, and the slow, methodical rhythm of paddling trips. The Allagash Wilderness Waterway had been on my list for a while. Deep woods, long portages, remote campsites, no roads for miles. The kind of place you went to for solitude and came back from feeling slightly more human. The group was a decent mix. Some seasoned outdoorsy types, some weekend warriors, and a couple people who just wanted the experience. All adults, all capable enough. The first few hours of the trip had gone smooth. Weather was clear. Spirits were high. The lake we stopped at that night, Round Pond if I recall right, was one of those wide, still bodies of water that held onto heat longer than the air. Even as the sun started dropping behind the tall spruce and pine trees along the shoreline, the lake's surface stayed calm and warm. We found a decent site tucked back a bit from shore, just uphill enough to keep dry but still with a view. A fire ring. A picnic table someone had hauled in or built God knows how long ago. Flat ground for tents. It was as ideal as it gets. The plan was to make dinner early, have some drinks, and get settled. We strung up a big blue tarp over the eating area, rigged with some paracord between a few trees, the corners cinched tight to withstand the light breeze that had started kicking up. I checked the weather on the inReach before we lost cell signal for good. One of those spotty warnings. Chance of thunderstorms, high winds possible, nothing too specific. It was northern Maine in early summer. You could get heat stroke and hypothermia in the same day up there. We figured we'd be fine. By dusk, a few clouds had started rolling in. The air had that weight to it, like everything was being slowly pressed down. Still warm, but thick and unmoving. I've been through enough summer storms to know when things are about to turn, and this felt like one of those times. We doubled up on stakes for the tents, reinforced the tarp, stashed dry bags under the picnic table. Around 9, the first rumble of thunder rolled across the lake like distant artillery. Everyone was still laughing then, drinking from metal cups and passing around trail mix, but I noticed a few of them look up at the sky with that nervous sort of half smile. No rain yet, just the wind picking up, leaves turning over, the smell of ozone in the air. It hit faster than any of us expected. Within minutes, the thunder was right on top of us. Sharp, jagged bolts lit up the tree line like flashbulbs. Then the rain came, sheets of it sideways. The wind drove it under the tarp, soaking everyone before we could react. The guy who had been napping, I won't use names here, doesn't matter, had gone to bed early in his tent, a newer 2-person setup that was pitched close to the edge of camp near a stand of spruce. The tarp, despite our prep, failed almost immediately. One corner ripped clean out of the grommet and flapped wildly. The other side sagged from the weight of pooled rainwater. It folded inward like a collapsed lung. Someone shouted. Someone dropped a cup. We were all scrambling at once, trying to grab the flapping edge and retie it, keep the food and packs dry. I was holding one end with both hands, braced against a tree, when the microburst hit. There's no other way to describe it. 1 second, it was just high wind. The next, it felt like the whole world tried to suck upward and then slam downward all at once. Trees bent like rubber. Rain came in horizontal. My hat blew off and was gone in an instant. The tarp ripped clean in half. The sound of wind drowned out everything else. And then crack, a noise sharper than the thunder, deeper somehow. I turned in time to see the tree fall. It wasn't huge, maybe 8 inches thick, but it was tall and it came down like a battering ram, straight onto the tent where the guy had been sleeping. I froze for a second. Everything slowed down. There was a moment where nobody moved, like our brains hadn't caught up yet. Then someone near me shouted for a head count. We looked around. 6 of us under the tarp mess, 1 crouched by the fire ring, and 1 missing. Him. I ran. The tent was crushed flat. The pole bent into a curve over the middle, one end pinned under the tree. It had missed the thick part of the trunk, thank God, and landed mostly along the branches and upper half, but the weight was enough to bury the tent into the dirt. He was yelling inside, not loud, but in that panicked, muffled way that makes your blood run cold. I dropped to my knees beside the wreck and started pulling at the rain fly. Water poured off in sheets. Someone else ran over to help. For a few frantic seconds, I thought about grabbing my knife and slicing into the fabric. The tent was brand new, and I knew that was a stupid concern, but my mind was overloaded and locked on the first idea that came. Instead, we grabbed the end of the tree. It wasn't too thick to lift with 2 people, and heaved it just enough to drag the tent clear. The frame groaned but didn't snap. We dragged the whole thing 2 feet to the side and unzipped the door. He tumbled out, soaking wet, shaking, eyes wide. No blood, no obvious injury. He was speaking but not making sense. That kind of adrenaline shock where nothing connects. I wrapped an arm around him and walked him toward the driest tent we had, shouting for someone to grab dry clothes. Inside, he collapsed into a sleeping bag, still shivering despite the warmth. I stripped off his soaked shirt, pulled on fleece, and zipped the bag around him. A few others followed with socks and extra layers. No one spoke much. The rain was still hammering down. Outside, the rest of us gathered under what was left of the tarp. 2 corners had survived. The fabric hung like a ripped curtain, flapping in the wind. We stood on the benches of the picnic table, trying to stay off the water pooling around our boots. The storm hadn't finished yet. We huddled shoulder to shoulder, trying to stay upright as the wind pushed us sideways. For over an hour, we stood like that. Nobody sat, nobody ate, just watched the sky and waited. When it finally broke, it didn't fade out like usual. It just stopped. 1 minute chaos, next minute calm. The rain tapered to a drizzle, and then nothing. The lake was still. Trees stood dripping. Steam rose from the ground in soft spirals. We climbed down from the benches one by one and checked the site. The fire pit had flooded, but the coals still held heat. I dropped down and started poking with a stick, pushing the wetwood aside until I found the glowing embers, then stacked dry twigs from our emergency bundle nearby. Slowly, patiently, the fire caught. The smell of smoke was like a switch flipped. People started moving again. Someone pulled out a bottle of bourbon and passed it around. Just 1 slug each. Nobody said anything, but the message was clear. We got lucky, really lucky. I checked on the guy in the tent again. He was already dozing, dry and warm, still pale but breathing slow. He'd be okay. The tree that fell had just missed killing him by maybe 18 inches. If it had landed closer to the base or at a different angle, we'd have been calling for a medevac at best. Maybe digging a grave at worst. The weight of that thought sat heavy on me as I stood near the fire, sipping from a dented metal cup. After a while, people started pulling out the pieces of the site. 1 guy rebuilt the tarp as best he could. 2 others bailed out flooded tents and restaked the lines. Someone found the bottle of red wine that had stayed sealed and set it on the table like an offering. We had steaks planned for dinner that night, sealed in a soft cooler bag. Still cold, still dry. The guy who'd been in the crushed tent woke up about an hour later, stretched, stood up slow, and walked over to the fire like nothing had happened. He took the tongs, poured himself a glass of wine, and started flipping steaks. It was surreal. Just 2 hours earlier, we thought we'd be calling in an emergency evac. Now he was grilling with a glass of wine in his hand like it was any other summer evening. We voted as a group to keep going the next morning. We could have pulled out, gone back the way we came, or waited for help. But nobody wanted to end the trip like that. The tent had a bent pole, not broken. We splinted it with a stick and duct tape. Good enough for the rest of the trip. The next few days were smooth, better even. The near miss seemed to quiet everyone down a bit. We paddled slower, talked less, listened more. The river was beautiful. Mist rising in the mornings, loons calling at night, moose tracks in the mud along the shore. That kind of quiet you don't get anywhere else. At night, we'd sit around the fire and just watch the flames. No one brought up the storm. No one had to. It was there in the silence. By the time we pulled out at the end of the route, we were all sunburned, bug-bitten, sore, and smiling. The crushed tent held together. The guy who'd almost died was cracking jokes and helping carry canoes to the trailer. We took a group photo beside the sign, still wet from sweat and river water. I think about that night more often. The first time I felt real fear on that trip wasn't when we got turned around, or when the wind picked up, or even when my legs started shaking so hard I couldn't feel them anymore. It was when I realized I had no idea how far we still had to go, and there was no way I could paddle the whole thing out. But there I was, in the bow, alone in my thoughts, staring down the same stretch of brutal, narrow water that had already taken hours off my life. This trip was supposed to be good for us. That's how it always starts. It's always supposed to be good for you. A reset. Something simple and clean. Paddle in, camp, paddle out. We'd done a few short backcountry overnights before. Nothing this long, nothing this deep into the bush, nothing with this many portages. But we were feeling bold this time. Stupid bold. That late summer kind of confidence, where you forget how fast the weather can turn in September. Where you think you're fitter than you are just because you haven't had a cigarette in a few weeks and your backpack feels light in your apartment. I hadn't trained for this. None of us had. And by the time I realized how hard it was going to be to get out, I was already in too much pain to do anything but keep moving forward. The paddle in had taken longer than expected. That was the first red flag, but it didn't set in until later. We were doing a loop, drop in at one access point, wind through a chain of small lakes, camp for 2 nights on a larger lake, and then exit from the far side. It looked doable on the map. Tight but doable. We split the group into 3 canoes. Mine was a 2-person setup with my partner. The others were 3-person canoes, and they moved better in the wind, more balanced, more muscle power. But they were heavier too, so at the time I didn't envy them. That first day paddling in was long. Real long. The kind of long that turns your arms to jelly by early afternoon. It wasn't just distance. It was dragging boats across rocky landings, thick brush, uneven ground, fallen trees, mud-slicked slopes, portage after portage. Some of them weren't marked well at all. I remember that more than anything, how poorly the trails were maintained between some of the lakes. One had a downed birch right across it with a thick hornet nest hanging low from one of the branches. We went around through bush so thick it felt like swimming with your body. Another portage just ended. No sign of where to put the canoe back in. We had to split up, bushwhack for 15 minutes before one of the guys shouted back that he'd found a game trail that led to the water. By the time we hit the final lake, it was dusk. I couldn't feel my hips. My shoulders ached like I'd been in a car crash. We ate cold wraps in silence, set up camp in the dark, and I barely made it into the tent before passing out. I should have known then. I should have looked at how far we'd come and thought about how far we still had to go back out. But I didn't, because the night was quiet, the lake was still, and I thought we'd be stronger after the rest day. The second day we just stayed put, fished a little, tried to hike a short trail we thought looped around a ridge, but it just sort of disappeared into swamp. Mostly we slept, ate, talked, tried to stretch. I drank almost 2 liters of water that day and still didn't feel hydrated. My lower back felt wrong, a kind of dull pressure that didn't go away when I lay down. I didn't sleep well. Sometime in the middle of the night, a cold front rolled in hard. I woke up shaking. My partner had already stuffed themselves deep into their sleeping bag. I remember reaching for my hoodie, only to realize I'd left it in the canoe dry bag. Too far. I wasn't going out there, so I curled into a ball and waited. In the morning, I knew I was in trouble. We broke camp early, around 6. The air was still and cold, which should have helped, but it didn't. I couldn't lift my arms properly. My wrists were shot from gripping the paddle so long the day before. Even tying down our gear was a struggle. I kept thinking I was getting slower, but I didn't know how bad it had gotten until we pushed off into the water, and I couldn't even paddle 10 strokes without my arms giving out. I was in the bow again, my partner in the stern, steering. At first we were quiet. There wasn't much wind yet, and the surface of the lake looked glassy and calm. I thought maybe this won't be so bad. Maybe we're over the hard part. We weren't, not even close. The wind picked up by the time we hit the middle of the lake. Came out of nowhere, cold and strong, blowing directly into us. Our light little 2-person canoe started veering sideways every time I dipped the paddle. My partner called out directions behind me, but the wind was so loud I couldn't make them out. We switched sides every minute or so, just trying to stay straight, and we weren't making progress. I remember that clearly. The shoreline we were aiming for didn't get closer. We just sat there, paddling with everything we had, staying in one spot. The others were trying to move too, but they weren't doing much better. The 3-person canoes were at least more stable. One of them managed to make a few hundred yards before having to rest, but they looked like they were hurting. At some point, we stopped paddling just to see if we were drifting, and we were backwards. The wind was pushing us back toward our campsite. I looked behind me and realized the trees I'd thought we'd left behind an hour ago were still right there. That was the first time I felt it. Real panic. That deep body panic. Like your chest is tightening and you can't control your limbs. There was no turning back. We didn't have food for another night. We'd already pushed hard just to get where we were. And the forecast said the wind would only get worse by evening. So we kept going. We made it to the far edge of the lake by late morning. It had taken over 3 hours to cross a stretch that should have taken maybe 35 minutes on a normal day. I was trembling. My hands couldn't grip the paddle properly anymore. Every joint in my body felt like it was on fire. But I didn't say anything. No one did. We just dumped the gear on the rocky landing and sat in silence for a few minutes. I remember someone dry heaving behind a bush. Someone else rubbing their shoulders like they were trying to crack a rib loose. The next portage was long, close to 1 kilometer, and steep. Halfway through, I dropped the gear bag and just stood there, frozen. My legs wouldn't lift. My thighs were locked in some kind of cramp. I bent forward and nearly passed out. My partner helped me finish that portage, carried the paddles, and came back for the life jackets. I took the lighter food barrel and still barely made it. The next lake was narrow and winding, which would have helped in lighter wind, but we were boxed in by tall ridges on both sides, and the gusts were funneled through like a tunnel. Headwind again. Every bend felt like starting over. I was paddling solo half the time because my partner was too exhausted to keep up. When I switched out with them, I couldn't even match the power they were putting in. We didn't talk. We didn't look at each other. Just paddled. Every 10 strokes, we'd switch sides. 10 more. Switch again. It became this brutal rhythm of pain and breath and wind and silence. By the time we reached the second-to-last portage, I was hallucinating slightly. Just little things. Movement in the trees. Lights that weren't there. I thought I saw a black bear on the trail ahead and froze up completely, but it was just a stump. My feet were bleeding from raw blisters inside wet hiking shoes. I hadn't noticed until I took them off at the portage and saw the heel of my sock soaked in dark red. The skin there was gone, just raw flesh pressing into soaked fabric. Still, I couldn't stop. No one could. We had no choice. We made it to the last lake close to sunset. The light was golden, pretty even, but none of us noticed. We were too far gone. The final push across that lake should have been easy. Short paddle, straight shot, calm wind, but my body was done. I could barely sit upright in the canoe. Every paddle stroke felt like I was digging glass into my arms. My neck locked up at one point and I had to brace my head against my shoulder just to keep it from flopping sideways. My partner was doing everything they could behind me, but even they were fading. The landing finally came into view. The access point, a shitty gravel slope with some people standing around, loading gear into trucks. I wanted to cry, not from joy, from pain. We pulled in, barely able to get out of the canoe. I stood up and nearly fell sideways. My legs weren't working right. I stumbled onto the shore, dropped to my knees, and just sat there breathing. We'd made it, but I wasn't okay. That night, in the motel room we found 20 minutes from the access point, I sat on the bathroom floor for over an hour, shivering, still cold, still sore. I couldn't even shower. My body just didn't want to move anymore. I slept 13 hours straight and woke up drenched in sweat. It took 3 full days before I could walk normally again. My shoulders were swollen, and my hips had massive bruises where the portage straps had dug in. My fingers stayed numb for almost a week. We never talked about doing another trip after that. That silence between us stayed, not out of anger, just we knew we'd pushed too far. We hadn't trained, we weren't prepared, and we were lucky, honestly, because if that wind had come earlier, or if we'd lost a canoe, or if someone had gotten hurt. I grew up in the southern part of the U.S., right on the edge of a national forest. Not near it, right at the edge of it. You could stand on my back porch and see nothing but thick trees stretching out like a wall. A solid green mass that turned black at night. It was a peaceful place most of the time. The kind of quiet that only people far from cities ever really know. We didn't have neighbors in any real sense. The closest one was maybe a quarter mile down the road, and even then, they were tucked behind woods and a bend. You didn't just bump into anyone out here. If someone was on your land, they meant to be there. My folks bought the place for the quiet and the space. We had chickens, a garden, and a couple of goats. I was in my late teens during the time this happened, still living at home, helping out with chores and working part-time in town. We weren't survivalists or anything, just people who liked being left alone. One thing we didn't like though, armadillos. They were a serious problem. Every summer, they'd tear through the garden like little tanks with shovels for feet. My mom spent hours every spring planting vegetables, and by July they'd already rooted up half the rows. We tried fencing, repellents, motion lights, you name it. None of it worked for long. Armadillos don't scare easy, and they're almost impossible to trap. Eventually, my dad decided the best way to deal with them was the old-fashioned way. Every night around 10 or 11, I'd go out with the shotgun and a flashlight. We had an old 12-gauge pump, short-barreled and beat up, but it worked fine. I wasn't out to blast anything I didn't need to, just scare them off or put one down if it came back too often. I'd make a slow walk around the yard, check the edge of the trees, peek under the shed, and go back inside. Took about 15 minutes most nights. I'd done this routine for over a year by the time that summer rolled around. I didn't spook easy anymore. I'd had big raccoons run out from under my feet, had owls come screaming down from trees, and even once caught a pair of bobcats scrapping just inside the treeline. None of it bothered me anymore. You get used to those things. Nature's loud, messy, and weird sometimes. I respected it, and it mostly left me alone. That night started like any other. The air was thick and hot, even though the sun had been down for hours. It had been a rough day for heat, up into the upper 90s, and the humidity stuck to everything like a wet towel. I remember stepping outside and instantly sweating. You could feel the heat still radiating off the porch steps. The cicadas were going wild, their buzzing echoing through the woods like power lines humming. Frogs were croaking near the pond. Crickets chirped like they were trying to outsing each other. I walked down the back steps with the shotgun, flashlight clipped just below the barrel. I didn't need to look far. Most of the time I could hear the armadillos before I saw them, snuffling, digging, sometimes crashing into a tomato cage like idiots. But this night I didn't hear anything. Not at first. I did a slow circle of the yard. Nothing under the shed. Nothing near the garden. No signs of fresh digging either. I figured maybe the heat had kept them down, and I was just about to head back inside when it happened. I just stepped onto the porch again when the silence hit. It wasn't like someone turned the volume down. It was like everything got ripped out of the air all at once. Every single sound stopped. No frogs, no bugs, not even wind. Total silence. I froze. I've heard that kind of quiet before, once when I ran into a bear while hiking. But even then, it wasn't this dead. This was like the earth had been vacuum sealed. I couldn't even hear the trees moving, and they should have been swaying in the breeze. But they weren't. They stood stiff and still like cardboard cutouts. My stomach dropped. Every hair on my arms and neck stood up. Felt wrong. Not in a I'm being watched kind of way. More like I just stepped into the middle of something I shouldn't be seeing. Like I'd walked into the middle of a ritual or a hunt or something ancient and quiet and very, very focused. I raised the shotgun slowly and clicked the light on. The beam cut through the dark like a knife. The LED bulb was strong. It could reach out maybe 60 yards if I aimed it just right. I scanned across the backyard, moving toward the treeline. There was nothing unusual at first. Just trees. My mom's garden. The edge of the lawn. A couple of old buckets I'd forgotten to put away. Then I saw the eyes. They were about 50 yards away, just inside the treeline. Not hidden, but not obvious either. Just there, staring back at me. 2 red dots. Now, let me be clear. I've seen plenty of animal eyes at night. Deer, foxes, raccoons, coyotes, bobcats, you name it. They all glow in different ways when you shine a light on them. Some are blue-green, some are yellow-white. But red? That's rare. And I'm not talking the faint amber red you sometimes get with a deer. These were glowing like brake lights. Bright, like somebody had taken 2 red LEDs and hung them in midair. And they were far apart, more than a foot. That's wide. Too wide for most animals that size. And here's the part that still knots my stomach even now. There was nothing behind them. No outline of a body. No ears. No fur. No shadow. Just eyes. Like they were floating. And they were high. 4 feet off the ground, maybe more. Not down where a fox or raccoon would be. These were up at chest level. Human height. But they didn't move like human eyes. They didn't blink. They didn't sway. They just stared. I raised the shotgun without thinking and fired. The sound exploded through the night like thunder. The flash lit up the yard. I expected whatever it was to jump or bolt or at least react. But the eyes didn't move. Not an inch. The red just hung there in the dark like 2 coals stuck in the air. Then it growled. It didn't roar. It didn't shriek. It growled. Low, deep, and slow. Like an idling diesel engine wrapped in gravel. I could feel it vibrate in my ribs. It rolled through the air and settled in my chest like wet cement. It was the kind of sound that doesn't make sense until you've heard it. Something that feels too big, too solid, to come from anything that should be in those woods. I started backing up. I kept the shotgun pointed straight at the eyes and pumped the next round. Fired again. Boom. Flash. Nothing. I still there. Another growl, louder this time, and they started moving. Toward me. Not running. Not leaping. Just slow, steady steps. Forward. I fired again. And again. I backed all the way up the steps, fumbling with the doorknob behind me, trying to keep the light on it while reloading shells. I was shaking so hard I dropped 2. I had 3 left. I fired 1 more. Still there. I finally threw open the door, slammed it shut behind me, and flicked on the floodlights. They blasted the backyard in white. I dropped the shotgun onto the floor, ran to the nearest window, and looked out. The eyes were gone. There was nothing but grass and trees and a faint line of smoke from the gunshots. Then, from the other side of the door, I heard a sound I will never forget. It was a hiss, long, sharp, and angry, like pouring water on a campfire. Faded quick, but it was real. Not an animal sound, not air pressure or pipes or bugs. Sounded mad and close. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room with the shotgun across my lap, lights on, eyes glued to the windows. I kept thinking it might come back, whatever it was, but it didn't, and it never has. The next morning, I went outside as soon as the sun was up. The air was hot and sticky already, but at least I could hear the birds again. Everything felt normal. Too normal. I walked the edge of the yard, right up to the place where I'd seen the eyes. I found broken leaves, a couple of shell casings, and boot prints mine. But no blood, no fur, no disturbed ground, nothing. I talked to my dad about it later, and he just said I'd probably seen a bear or a big cat, maybe even an injured deer. But I've seen all those before, and none of them made me feel like that. None of them have eyes that glow like brake lights without a body behind them. I still live near those woods. I still hunt, hike, and camp when I get the chance. But I don't go outside at night without floodlights on now. And I don't ever shine my flashlight into the trees longer than I have to. Because deep down, I know whatever I saw that night didn't belong there. And I hope to God it doesn't come back. I've spent years guiding campers through one of the most stunning, wild swamps in the southeast. It's the kind of place you see in postcards. Cypress trees rising out of dark, still water, Spanish moss hanging low like a curtain between worlds, the echo of frogs and birds filling the air. But it's not a postcard. It's real. And when you're deep in it, miles from help, things can go sideways fast. That month, one long, brutal month, I almost died twice. I haven't really told many people the full story, but I'll tell it here because it still sits in my body like a weight I can't shake. The first time was during what started as a normal afternoon paddle. It was late fall, so the days were short but still warm in the sun. I was leading a group of campers through one of the remote routes that wound through the swamp like a lazy river. The water was calm, flat, quiet in the way that makes your bones feel still. We had spent the day moving through long, narrow passages where the trees almost touched overhead, like we were floating through a tunnel of green. Around 5:30 p.m., we decided to make for the nearest camping platform, about an hour away. That's when I noticed the clouds starting to turn gold. Sunset was coming fast. The group was spread out a little, me in the front, a few in the middle, one in the rear. I had one camper with me in a tandem canoe. We weren't going fast, just steady, and I wasn't worried. I'd done this route dozens of times. About 30 minutes into the final leg, the sun dipped low, and the sky lit up orange and red behind the tree line. We came out of a tight channel and into one of the wide-open pools of water. No banks, no trees around, just water and the setting sun. It was beautiful, sure, but open water always makes me feel exposed. I remember thinking we should paddle faster to beat the dark. That's when it happened. One moment I was upright, the next I was flipped. I still don't know exactly how. Maybe I leaned too far. Maybe a submerged log tipped us. It doesn't matter. The canoe went over hard and fast, and suddenly I was in the water. It was deep, the kind of deep where your feet never hit anything. I came up fast, took a breath, and grabbed the edge of the flipped canoe. The camper had popped up too, shaken but okay, and somehow had managed to stay near her paddle and the group's gear. She had a better angle and reclimbed onto a floating seat cushion. I tried to right the canoe. I tried twice. My gear was tied down, but it was submerged, heavy, pulling the canoe deeper with it. No matter what I did, it kept slipping under and rolling back over. After a few minutes, I gave up and just held on to the side. That's when I looked up. He was maybe 50 feet away. I don't like calling him it. That makes it sound abstract. He was a gator, big, at least 8 feet, maybe 9, just floating there, watching. It was that kind of still watching that gators do, no sound, just nostrils and eyes above water like a log, except you know it isn't. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I didn't splash, didn't shout. The camper looked at me. I could tell she wanted to ask what to do, but she saw my face and stayed quiet. The others were far off. She paddled off quietly to get help. I floated there, gripping the side of that flipped canoe, barely moving, for close to 20 minutes. It felt like hours. The sun slipped lower and lower. The orange turned to pink, then to a washed-out gray-blue. Every sound around me seemed loud: bugs, frogs, the tiny splash of my own movement. I kept my eyes on the gator. He stayed in place for a while, then started to drift slowly toward me. I wasn't thinking clearly, just breathing, trying not to shiver. The water soaked through everything. My clothes, my shoes, my skin. I started to feel that bone-deep cold that sinks into you when your body gives up trying to stay warm. Then, finally, in the distance, I saw the other canoes coming back. Flashlights bobbing. They reached me fast. I climbed into one of the campers' canoes. Wet, shaking, silent. We left my sunken canoe behind in the dark water. The gator disappeared into the night. No one spoke much. We got to the platform, set up camp, and I lay there shivering most of the night. I didn't sleep. I watched the stars and kept hearing water move. I kept seeing that gator's eyes in the dark. The next morning, we went back and pulled the canoe out. It was heavy with water, but it floated again once we got the gear out. We paddled on. I didn't talk about what had happened. I just kept moving forward. I thought that would be the worst thing that ever happened to me in that swamp. I was wrong. Less than 2 weeks later, I was back in the same area with a new group. The weather forecast said scattered showers. That was normal. We packed for it: rain gear, tarps, fast-drying clothes. No big deal. We reached the platform around dusk and set up camp. I remember the air felt different, heavier. Still, there weren't as many birds that evening, and the frogs were quiet. We ate dinner on the platform, cleaned up, and everyone got into their tents. Around 2:30 a.m., I woke up to a low rumble, distant thunder. I lay there waiting, hoping it would pass. Then the wind came, not a breeze, gusts. The tent walls flattened against me, then popped back out. I sat up fast, grabbed my flashlight, and reached for the zipper. That's when the rain hit, cold, hard, like needles. It came sideways, pushed by winds I later found out were clocked at over 60 miles per hour. The tent started to lift, and I realized I wasn't just in danger of a broken pole or a ripped fly. I was about to go off the edge. The platform we were on was maybe 15 feet across. It floated, anchored in place, but it wasn't wide. My tent had been pitched near the edge, like all of them. The rain soaked everything in seconds, and the gusts pushed my tent closer and closer to the side. I tried to unzip the door. My hands were shaking. Everything was wet. The zipper snagged. I pulled again. Nothing. I was on my knees, clawing at it like an animal. Then the tent moved, just a foot, but it was enough to shift my weight, and I could feel the edge of the platform under my knees. One more gust and I'd go over. The swamp was right there, black, cold, full of rain and creatures I couldn't see. I finally found the zipper pull and yanked it open. I dove out and sprawled on the wood, gasping. The wind was howling now. I heard other tents collapse, fabric flapping, people crying out. Campers were scrambling out of their tents, soaked and panicked. The platform was chaos, wet, loud, blinding with wind and rain. Flashlights flickered. We all huddled under the tarp near the gear bins, but it barely helped. Everything was drenched. One camper begged me to call for rescue. I didn't want to, it felt like giving up, but I looked at their faces and knew they weren't just scared. They were terrified. So I called 911. Took a while to get through. The dispatcher asked me where we were. I explained. They said they'd try to get someone out. I waited. The rain kept coming. Thunder cracked. Then my phone rang again. It was my boss. "They're not coming," he said. "It's too dangerous. No boats can launch right now. No one's coming until daylight." I stood there on the platform, phone still in my hand, soaked to the skin, wind ripping at the tarp above us, and I realized that we were on our own. I had 10 people with me. Some were shaking uncontrollably. One was crying softly. We were all cold. We were all scared, and we were going to be that way for the next 4 hours. I told them the truth, that we had to wait. I gathered everyone close, and we sat in a circle, back to back, trying to stay warm. The tarp collapsed halfway through the night. We didn't fix it. We couldn't. We were too tired. And the mosquitoes came, right after the rain stopped, before the sun even hinted at rising. They came in clouds. I've lived with mosquitoes. I've camped in every season. But this was another level. The storm had stirred everything up, and they came like a curse, buzzing, biting, relentless. We wrapped our faces with wet clothes, buried our hands inside jackets, but it didn't help much. I stopped swatting after a while. There was no point. Those 4 hours between 3 and 7 a.m. were the longest of my life. My muscles ached from sitting. My face burned from bites. My clothes were soaked and clung to my skin like a second, colder body. I kept checking the horizon, waiting for that first light, waiting for something to change. And finally, it did. The sky turned gray, then silver. The swamp came back to life. I heard birds, saw color. The worst was over. I stood up slowly, stretched my legs, and looked at the group. Everyone looked like hell. Red eyes, wet clothes, bug-bitten faces. But alive. We packed up in silence. Everything was heavy, wet bags, soaked tents, sagging tarps. We loaded the canoes, checked every strap and rope twice, and started to paddle. The air was cool and still. Mist drifted across. It started as one of those big ideas that feel too bold to pass up when you're staring at maps in the middle of the night with a beer in hand and too much confidence in your bones. I'd been itching for a serious backcountry experience. Not the kind where you can hear cars humming down a highway if the wind blows right, but a real wilderness immersion. Something that would push every muscle and nerve in my body. I came across the Debskoniag Lakes Wilderness in Maine while reading through some old trip reports on a forum buried deep in a web of backpacking blogs. One guy had written, "Don't come here unless you like pain and silence." That was it. That was the hook. I called up my best friend, Jack, who was living out in California at the time. We'd done a lot of hiking, some alpine stuff, and plenty of off-trail exploring. We'd snowboarded down couloirs that we had no business climbing, but we had never, been in a canoe. Not alone, anyway. Rafting trips with guides? Sure. But the idea of navigating a 28-mile loop of interconnected lakes, carrying the canoe over rocky portages, fighting wind and weather, that was a whole different beast. I didn't mention that when I pitched it to him. I told him Maine was calling. He booked a flight. We landed in Bangor and drove a couple hours north to a town that felt like it only had one gas station, one bar, and maybe 400 residents if you counted their dogs. We stayed the night in a motel that smelled like an old tackle box and picked up our gear in the morning from a local who'd been recommended to us on a forum. The guy was kind, probably in his mid-50s with calloused hands and a beard that looked like it could survive a nuclear winter. He was going to set us up with a lightweight Kevlar canoe. But just before we left, he noticed a hairline crack along the side. "Can't let you take this one," he said, running a thumb across the split. He pulled out another from the back of the barn. A big, dented old canoe that looked like it had seen more war than water. We later came to call her Big Bertha. She was maybe 80 pounds, maybe more. She flexed in none of the right ways, creaked when she shifted, and had absolutely no right being on a trip like this. But she floated, and we were behind schedule, so we loaded her on the roof, signed a waiver that basically said, "Don't die," and hit the road to the launch. We were hyped, I won't lie. I think we even smoked a joint on the drive up to the launch, bouncing down a gravel road with potholes deep enough to sink a boot. We watched 2 or 3 YouTube videos titled things like "How to Paddle a Canoe Like a Pro" and "Canoeing for Beginners." It looked simple enough. One person in the back steers, the front sets the pace. Some J-strokes. A draw here, a pry there. We got it. We were both strong, well-balanced, and coordinated. What could possibly go wrong? Everything, as it turns out. By the time we strapped our packs into the canoe, the sun was already slipping low in the sky. We had maybe 2 hours of light left. The lake was wide, at least a mile across, and long, with little coves and rocky islands scattered like breadcrumbs along the shore. We needed to make it 8 miles to our intended first night site. There was a stiff breeze kicking up from the north, and the surface of the water was covered in a patchy chop, just big enough to be annoying, not quite dangerous. Yet, we shoved off, both of us smiling like idiots. I was up front, because I'm 6 feet 7 inches and Jack figured the bow had more legroom. Spoiler, it didn't. My knees were folded up awkwardly. I was sitting basically on the floor, legs crammed under a narrow bench, with my paddle already clinking off the side of the boat before we even got 50 yards out. Immediately, we started zigzagging. Wildly, we couldn't hold a straight line to save our lives. We'd paddle hard on one side, start veering off, then switch. The canoe felt top-heavy and unstable. With every gust of wind or passing ripple, the thing would rock side to side like it was flirting with flipping. I was drenched in sweat, barely paddling for 10 minutes. The sun dipped lower. The wind got worse. We looked around and saw that we had made it maybe half a mile, and it had taken the better part of 40 minutes. I remember my arms already burning, my thighs locked up from the awkward seating, and my spine aching from trying to adjust my posture. At one point, we just stopped paddling, let ourselves drift to the nearest rocky outcrop, and pulled out the phone one last time before we lost signal. We watched one more video, still couldn't figure it out. That night, we crash-landed on a small, private-looking island not even a mile from the launch point. It was barely a spit of land with a few trees, some exposed granite, and enough room for a tent if we didn't mind the slope. The sky turned purple and then black while we hammered in stakes and tried to laugh off the fact that we were absolutely screwed. The forecast had said some storms were coming later in the week. We hadn't even made it 1 mile, and we already hated our canoe. The next morning, we crawled out of the tent stiff and sore, stomachs growling. The boat sat where we had dragged it up the night before. Jack stood there scratching his head, looking at it like it was a puzzle. And then I saw it. The seats. They were asymmetrical. The one I had been in, the bow, had a weird angle and hardly any legroom. It wasn't just uncomfortable. It wasn't right. And it hit us both at the same time, like getting punched in the face with stupidity. We had paddled the thing backwards. The stern seat, the one meant for steering, had the space, the shape, the proper orientation. We had loaded all our gear backwards, sat backwards, and paddled like lunatics into a headwind in an unbalanced boat. We should have flipped, easily. I think it was only sheer luck and our combined physicality that kept us upright. We just stood there in silence, staring at the canoe like it was mocking us. Then we burst out laughing, hard. It was the kind of laugh you only get when the stakes were too high and you just narrowly avoided something truly stupid. We sat there for an hour, still howling, drinking bad instant coffee, and watching the sun burn off the mist around the shoreline. That day, we took everything out of the canoe, flipped it around, loaded it correctly, and paddled out onto the lake again. And it was easy, like actually easy. Tracked straight. The balance felt natural. We moved fast. We actually got into a rhythm. The miles started to melt away, and with every one we felt more and more like we had stepped into something special. The next 4.5 days were the hardest and most humbling outdoor experience of my life. The Debskoniag Lakes chain is no joke. Each portage felt like a punishment. The trails were rocky and muddy, snaking through dense forest that seemed to get thicker the deeper we got. Tree roots coiled across the ground like veins, wet and slippery. Sometimes the trail would disappear into waist-high brush. Sometimes it would dive down a steep embankment and we'd have to lower Big Bertha by hand, slipping and sliding with our gear. And Bertha, Jesus, carrying that thing felt like shouldering a rusted-out car door. We'd switch off every few minutes, trying to balance her on shoulders already bruised from the first haul. Our arms ached. Our boots stayed soaked from ankle-deep mud. The downpours came like slaps, short, heavy, soaking. And yet, every time we rounded a corner and saw the next lake stretch out in front of us, glassy, untouched, with nothing but the sound of wind in the trees, it made all the pain worth it. We didn't see another person the entire time. Not a single soul. Just loons calling at dusk, moose tracks along muddy banks, and silent water that stretched to the edge of the earth. We camped on mossy clearings under thick pine canopies, cooked simple meals over small fires, and swam naked in icy water to rinse off the grime. At night, we'd lie there in the tent, listening to the soft hiss of wind moving through the trees, the creak of branches, and the occasional splash of something large moving just out of view. By the last day, we were raw. Our hands were blistered, legs covered in cuts and bites. My back had a knot so deep it felt like a golf ball lodged under the skin. But I didn't care. I'd never felt so alive. We carved through the final lake with steady strokes, calm water reflecting the sky like a mirror. The launch came into view around a bend, and we just stopped for a second, floating there in silence. We looked back the way we came, 28 miles, for portages, dozens of laughs, some real pain, one massive mistake at the start. But we'd done it. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't smooth, but it was ours. That trip taught me more than any hike, any climb, any road trip. Taught me about humility, about how overconfidence can be dangerous, about the beauty of fixing a mistake instead of quitting. And more than anything, it taught me that when things go wrong out there, sometimes all you can do is flip the boat around and keep paddling. I think about that trip often. I think about Big Bertha, about those long, aching hauls over granite and pine roots, about the way the lakes lit up gold at sunset, about how 5 days alone in the wilderness can make you feel more whole than 5 years in a city. Maine gave us a beating, but it also gave us something we didn't know we were missing. And yeah, next time I'll read the manual. Maybe. I worked one summer in a tiny ski resort town in northern New Mexico called Angel Fire. It's the kind of place that feels like it's forgotten by the rest of the world for most of the year. Just a handful of people in the summer and a little more bustle in the winter. I was hired as a horseback guide. During the day, I'd lead tourists along dusty mountain trails, riding through tall pine trees and wildflower meadows that stretched for miles. The air was thin up there, clean and cold, even in July. What most people didn't know was that my job had a second part. I'm a long-range shooter, competitive, practiced at hitting targets 800 to 1,000 yards away. When I was hired, my boss agreed I could bring my rifle with me to take care of some local coyotes that were attacking the livestock on nearby ranches. Coyotes are a real problem up there. They're smart and quick, and if you don't keep them in check, they tear through sheep and chickens and even sometimes young calves. The ranchers weren't joking when they said they'd lost more than a few animals lately. So I brought my rifle. It was a precision bolt action with a powerful scope, and I was confident in my ability to drop a coyote cleanly from a good distance. It wasn't about sport. It was about protecting the livestock and keeping the ranchers happy. The horse barn where I stayed was a small wooden building, perched near the edge of the main ranch property. The barn was old but sturdy, built from thick timber and with a steep roof that I sometimes climbed on to get a better view of the land around. From that rooftop, I could see across about 1,000 acres, fields, ranches, and the rough hills beyond. At night, with the full moon, I didn't need night vision to see maybe 400 to 600 yards clearly. The moonlight cut through the cold air like a spotlight. Most nights, I'd sit on the roof for hours, rifle in hand, waiting for the coyotes to appear. They'd come out quietly, slipping through the grass like shadows, and I'd pick them off one by one. That summer, I'd already shot 6 coyotes over several nights. The ranchers were grateful, and I was starting to feel like I was getting the hang of it. This one night was colder than most. The air was crisp, biting through my jacket even though I was wrapped in layers. The moon was full and bright, hanging low over the hills like a pale lantern. The town was dead quiet. Angel Fire was the kind of place that almost shut down at night. No streetlights, almost no cars, no barking dogs to spoil the silence. Everyone knew I was up on the barn roof hunting, so no one let their dogs out. It was perfect for me. I was about ready to pack up after a long night. The earlier gunshots had probably scared the coyotes off the mountain for a while. The fields below were empty, still, the grass gently swaying in the light breeze. I scanned the land one last time with my scope, my finger resting lightly on the trigger, when I saw it. A lone coyote appeared at the far edge of the field, loping slowly across the grass. It was maybe 200 yards away, walking like it didn't have a care in the world. The moonlight made its fur shine faintly silver. It moved smooth and steady, no hurry, no fear. I raised my rifle, lined up the shot carefully. I knew this one was a dead ringer for me. The distance was easy. I held my breath and squeezed the trigger. Nothing. The bullet zipped through the air, but the coyote didn't even flinch. Kept moving at the same pace, no change in direction or speed. I thought maybe I missed, so I fired again. Still nothing. The coyote trotted on like I hadn't even pulled the trigger. Cold knot formed in my stomach. That wasn't possible. I quickly checked my sights, trying to figure out if something was wrong with my scope or the rifle. I was about to reload when I remembered I had a tracer round, like the military uses, to check trajectory. I loaded it in and aimed again, watching the bullet's red streak light up the night as it passed through the animal. The coyote didn't even blink. It was like the bullet went through it without touching. The coyote kept walking calmly, almost like it was ignoring me completely. I threw my hands up in frustration. My rounds weren't cheap, and I wasn't about to waste more on something that didn't seem real. I lowered my rifle and watched the coyote fade into the dark grass. The next morning, I was talking to a local tribal elder. He was one of the few people in town who had lived there for decades. I told him what happened, and he just laughed quietly. He said the coyote was a spirit that shows up during full moons, especially when hunters are out with rifles. It's not harmful, he said, but it's a trickster that scares people who hunt coyotes aggressively. Some locals had even reported seeing it appear in their homes or yards. I didn't believe in spirits or magic, but the story stuck with me. I never saw the coyote again, but sometimes I'd hear strange yelps at night when no coyotes were around. Maybe it was just coyotes howling far off, but it was eerie. That summer, I had a lot of interesting moments in Angel Fire, but that night on the barn roof was one I never forgot. It was a reminder that sometimes nature throws you things you just can't explain. Not because of ghosts or magic, but because there are mysteries out there that don't fit the rules. I never saw that coyote again, but whenever the moon is full and bright, I think back to that night. The cold air, the quiet fields, and the strange, silent creature that seemed to be untouchable. The above is a detailed short story summary based on your prompt. However, you requested a very long, highly detailed, and realistic first-person story of about 5,000 words or more. Given the size, I'll begin now to write the full extended version with rich descriptions, sensory details, inner thoughts, and a thorough build-up, progressing in natural pacing to fully immerse you in the experience. This will be a single long, continuous narrative, no dialogues or conversations, just the internal perspective and environment to meet your request fully. The summer I spent working in Angel Fire, New Mexico, was one of the most intense and strange experiences I've ever had in the outdoors. The town itself is tiny, tucked up high in the mountains. At just over 8,000 feet in elevation, the air was thin and crisp. The summers were short and dry, but those months were packed with tourists coming to hike, ride horses, and escape the heat down below in the deserts and cities. The landscape was a mix of high desert and pine forests, with wide open fields that stretched for miles, broken up by ranches and patches of scrub. My job was to be a horseback guide, leading tourists along trails through the mountains and valleys. I liked the work well enough. The steady rhythm of a horse's gait, the smell of the pine and earth after rain, the distant cry of hawks overhead. But there was another part of the job I never expected when I accepted it. The ranchers around Angel Fire had a problem with coyotes. These animals were clever and relentless. They came down from the mountains to hunt the livestock. Chickens, sheep, sometimes calves, and the losses had started piling up. The ranchers were angry and desperate. When I was hired, my boss made a deal with me. Since I was an experienced long-range shooter, I could bring my rifle to help cull the coyote population. It was a practical solution, and it meant I had a reason to keep my rifle close at hand. Most nights after the day's work was done, I'd find myself climbing onto the roof of the horse barn. It was an old building with weathered boards and a steep roof covered in rough shingles, but the vantage point was perfect. From up there, I could look out across about 1,000 acres of land. Rolling fields, farm buildings, the patchwork of fences, and the hills that rose in the distance. Angel Fire was a place that practically went dark at night. There were no street lamps, no neon signs blinking, and hardly any cars driving around after sunset. The only light came from the moon and stars. On a full moon night, the whole world seemed bathed in a pale, silvery glow. I could see 400 or 500 yards clearly with my naked eye, and with my scope even more. I kept my rifle ready, sitting quietly on the cold wooden roof, scanning the fields for movement. The air was sharp and clean, the kind that bites at your skin and makes every breath feel crisp. Sometimes the wind would stir the tall grass, making it ripple like water. The smell of pine and earth mixed with the faint scent of livestock from the ranch below. That summer, I'd already taken out 6 coyotes over several nights. Each shot was careful and calculated. I always waited for a clear, clean shot to avoid wasting ammo or missing. The coyotes were smart, skittish, and quick to scatter after a gunshot, so each kill thinned the pack a little more. On this particular night, the air was colder than usual, almost biting, even though it was mid-July. The moon hung low and full, big and bright, almost unnaturally so. The sky was clear, filled with stars so bright it felt like the whole universe was watching. I was bundled up in my jacket, my boots resting on the shingles, rifle in hand. I had already packed up my gear in my mind, ready to call it a night after the coyotes seemed to have disappeared. The gunshots from earlier had likely pushed them back into the mountains. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I spotted movement on the far edge of the field below. A coyote was walking slowly, loping at an easy pace across the grass. It was about 200 yards. I hadn't been camping in years. Life had gotten busy, responsibilities piling up, and the simple pleasures like hiking or spending a night away from the city felt like distant memories. But this time, I was alone, craving something different. A break from the noise, the endless screens, and the people. I found an old cabin for rent, way off the beaten path, deep in the woods of a national forest a few states away from home. No cell service, no neighbors for miles, just me, the woods, and that cabin. The drive was long, winding down narrow, gravel roads through towering pine and fir trees. The last mile was rough and uneven, the old pickup truck rattling as I bounced over the dirt. I wasn't sure if the cabin was still in good shape from the photos, but the owner's description said it was rustic but livable, and I wanted raw nature, not some glamping experience. I pulled up at sunset, the fading orange light barely filtering through the dense forest canopy. The cabin was small, maybe 2 rooms, built from rough-hewn logs with a steep pitched roof covered in moss and pine needles. A chimney stuck up crookedly, and I could see the metal door to a wood stove inside through the window. A porch ran along the front, with a weathered rocking chair that creaked softly in the wind. There was no electricity, no running water, just an outhouse behind the cabin and a small well nearby. The air smelled sharp and clean, tinged with pine and damp earth. The temperature had dropped quickly, and I pulled my jacket tighter as I got out of the truck. My backpack was heavy with supplies, food, water, a lantern, extra batteries, blankets, and the small first aid kit I always carried. I locked the truck and carried everything to the cabin door, trying the rusty latch. It opened with a creak. Inside was dim but cozy. The main room had a rough wooden table, a couple of chairs, a shelf with canned food and old cooking pots, and the wood stove. I dropped my pack and got a fire going quickly, stacking dry pine kindling and splitting some logs I found by the side of the cabin. The flames sputtered to life, casting flickering shadows against the walls. The warmth was immediate and welcome, making the place feel less abandoned and more like a refuge. I spent the next hour unpacking and organizing. I put the food on the shelf, filled the metal basin with water from the well, and laid out my sleeping bag near the stove. The cabin was chilly but not freezing yet. I cooked some instant noodles on a small camping stove I'd brought, ate slowly while listening to the crackle of the fire and the occasional rustle of leaves outside. The forest was settling into night, and the darkness beyond the windows felt thick and endless. After eating, I lit the oil lantern and walked around the cabin's perimeter with a flashlight. The trees were close, so close I felt like they were pressing in on me. The wind whispered through the branches, carrying sounds of squirrels, maybe a fox or 2. I found some more dry wood stacked near the outhouse and brought it back. Back inside, I sat by the fire, staring into the flames and feeling my heart slow down. No noise but the wind, no one else for miles. The solitude was peaceful but also a little unsettling. It made me realize how rare it was to be truly alone. My phone was dead from lack of signal and no charger, so I couldn't even distract myself with music or messages. I decided to get some sleep early. I brushed my teeth with the cold well water, set the lantern low, and crawled into my sleeping bag. The wood stove still glowed faintly, and the fire crackled softly. Outside, the night deepened and grew colder. I pulled the blanket tighter around my shoulders. Sleep came slow. The dark pressed against the windows. Every snap of a twig or rustle in the trees made me tense. My mind imagined all sorts of things: a prowler, a wild animal, the old stories I'd heard about people going missing in the woods. But I told myself to stay calm. I was prepared, I was cautious, and I was safe inside this cabin. Then, just as I was drifting off, I heard something else. It was faint at first, a scraping sound near the back of the cabin, like nails on wood or something heavy dragged over rough ground. I froze, straining to hear. The wind had dropped. The sound came again, slow and deliberate. Not random branches, not the usual wildlife. I grabbed the flashlight, my heart pounding. I eased out of the sleeping bag, careful not to make noise, and crept to the door. The cabin's single window looked out onto a narrow clearing surrounded by thick forest. I swept the beam across the darkness but saw nothing. The noise came again, but now from the other side of the cabin. I moved slowly around to the back porch, flashlight pointed, every muscle tense. The outhouse stood there, half hidden in shadow. The scraping stopped. Silence returned. I waited for several minutes, listening to my own breathing. The fire in the stove was nearly out, so I added a log and tried to calm my nerves. I thought maybe it was an animal, raccoons or a bear trying to get into the trash. But the sound didn't match any wildlife I'd heard before. I decided to stay inside and keep the door locked. I sat down next to the stove, clutching a heavy cast iron skillet I'd found in the kitchen. I'd never felt this uneasy in the wilderness before. The isolation that felt so peaceful in daylight was now suffocating. The night dragged on. I forced myself to stay awake, listening, flashlight at the ready. Every so often, I heard something. A branch snapping far off, a low grunt or groan, the wind shifting. Then, around 3 a.m., I heard footsteps on the gravel path leading up to the cabin. The steps were slow, heavy, deliberate. Someone was walking toward me. I switched off the lantern to avoid being seen through the window. The cabin was pitch black except for the faint glow of the dying fire. The footsteps stopped just outside the porch. I held my breath, gripping the skillet, waiting. Minutes passed. No more movement. Then I heard the scrape again, this time at the cabin door. Someone was trying to open it, pulling at the handle, jiggling the latch. Panic surged through me. I tried the lock. It was broken. The latch rattled under pressure. I backed away, looking for a weapon. I grabbed a thick wooden chair, ready to swing it if the door gave way. The scraping became frantic, desperate, as if whoever was outside realized the door was locked but kept trying. The sound of a heavy boot pounding on the wood sent chills down my spine. Suddenly, the glass window near the door cracked with a sharp bang. I ducked instinctively, heart racing so loud I was sure they could hear it. For the next 20 minutes, I stayed motionless, listening. The footsteps finally faded into the woods, slow, retreating steps crunching on leaves and gravel. I stayed awake until dawn, too afraid to sleep. When morning came, I lit a fire and brewed some coffee, hands shaking. I looked outside for signs of who had come near the cabin. There were footprints in the soft ground around the porch, large, heavy boots, maybe 2 sets. No other signs, no dropped items, nothing but broken branches and trampled leaves. I searched the perimeter carefully. A makeshift campsite not far away caught my eye. An abandoned fire pit, some trash, a torn piece of fabric snagged on a branch. Someone had been living rough nearby. I packed quickly. I couldn't stay another night. I locked up, loaded my gear, and started the hike back to the truck, eyes peeled for any movement. On the way out, I kept thinking about who had been at the cabin. Someone homeless? A drifter? Or something more dangerous? The thought made my stomach churn. Back at the truck, I locked the doors and sat inside, breathing hard. The isolation that had felt like freedom was now a cage. I drove away slowly, glancing in the rearview mirror. The forest swallowed the cabin from view, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching me. The experience left me with a hard lesson about being alone in the wilderness. No matter how prepared you think you are, there are always risks. The woods don't care about your plans or your comfort. People do, though, and not all of them want you to be safe. I had been looking forward to this weekend for weeks. A quiet retreat, just me and the woods. The plan was simple. Leave the city behind, drive deep into the mountains, and spend a few days alone in a small cabin I found through an online listing. The pictures made it look perfect. Rustic, but not too remote. Just far enough away from civilization to feel like I was really getting away. The drive out there was long but uneventful. I left Friday afternoon after work with a backpack full of essentials. A few days' clothes, canned food, a portable stove, a flashlight, and the usual camping gear. I also brought extra batteries, a first aid kit, and a small hunting knife. Not that I was expecting any trouble, but you never know. The GPS route took me off the main highway and onto a narrow, winding dirt road. Trees pressed in from both sides, tall pines and oaks crowding overhead. The sun was already starting to dip low when I pulled up in front of the cabin. It looked just like the photos. A modest one-story structure made of weathered wood, a stone chimney, and a small porch with a creaky wooden bench. There was no cell signal here, but that was part of the appeal. I stepped out of the car, stretched my legs, and took a long breath. The air was crisp and smelled of pine needles and damp earth. A few birds called out, and the wind whispered through the branches. It was peaceful, perfect. Inside, the cabin was small but cozy. A single main room with a wood stove in the corner, a small kitchen area with a sink, no running water, just a tap that connected to a nearby well, a table, and a couple of chairs. There was a bedroom through a doorway with a bed and a rough wool blanket. The floor creaked a little underfoot, and the windows had thick curtains to keep out the cold at night. I unpacked my things, set up the stove with some firewood I found stacked near the back porch, and started a fire. It took some effort. The wood was damp from the recent rain, but eventually the fire caught, glowing warmly in the stove's iron belly. The cabin filled with the smell of burning pine and dry wood. Dinner was simple. Canned beans heated over the stove, some crackers, and a thermos of coffee I'd made at home. I sat at the table and ate slowly, enjoying the quiet. No traffic noise, no sirens. Just the occasional crackle from the fire and the distant sound of the forest. As night fell, the temperature dropped fast. I closed the curtains, piled on an extra sweater, and settled into the bed. The fire slowly died down, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Outside, the forest was alive with sound. The rustling of leaves, the hoot of an owl, something moving in the underbrush. I felt safe, though, wrapped in the cabin's shelter. Around midnight, I woke suddenly. Something was off. At first, I couldn't tell what it was. The silence inside the cabin felt too complete. Then I heard it. A faint scraping sound, like something dragging against wood. It was coming from outside, near the back porch. My heart started pounding. I lay still for a moment, trying to convince myself it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer. But the noise kept coming, slow and deliberate. A soft scratching against the wooden siding. Then a low thud, as if something heavy was dropped or kicked against the wall. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly stood up. The floorboards creaked under my feet as I moved toward the back door. The fire in the stove had almost burned out, leaving the room in near darkness. I flicked on the light and stepped outside. The night was cold and still. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds. I swept the beam of the flashlight around the clearing, searching for movement. At first, I saw nothing but shadows and trees. Then, about 15 feet from the porch, I caught a glimpse of something. A dark shape crouched low near the edge of the treeline. It didn't move right away, but it was definitely there. I shone the light directly on it, and it ducked behind a tree. I froze, trying to think. Whoever it was, they were close enough to reach the cabin quickly. I felt a rush of fear. Not the kind of fear you get from a scary movie, but a deep, real sense that something was wrong. I shut the door quickly and locked it, I double-checked the windows, making sure all the locks were secure. I grabbed my knife from the table and sat back down, trying to calm my racing heart. The rest of the night was a restless blur. Every few minutes I thought I heard footsteps outside, or the faint scrape of something brushing against the cabin. I kept the flashlight close, the knife on my lap, and listened as best I could. When dawn finally came, I didn't feel relief. Instead, I felt exposed. The forest looked different in the daylight, harsher somehow, less inviting. I stepped outside cautiously, scanning the perimeter. Near the back porch, I found marks in the dirt, footprints. They were boot prints, large and heavy, and they circled the cabin in a wide arc. There were also scrape marks on the siding, deep enough to catch my fingernail. I took pictures with my phone, but still no signal. The nearest house was miles away, and I was alone. I packed quickly, eating a cold breakfast as I did. I didn't want to stay another night. As I loaded my gear into the car, I noticed something else. A small bundle of sticks tied with a piece of twine, left on the porch steps. It looked deliberate, like a marker or a warning. I put the bundle in my pack and got in the car. I didn't look back as I started the engine and pulled onto the dirt road. The drive back felt tense. Every shadow in the woods seemed to shift in my peripheral vision. The radio played static, then bursts of faint voices, but no clear signal. When I finally reached the highway and cell service returned, I called the local sheriff's office to report what had happened. They took down my information but said there had been no recent reports of suspicious activity near the cabin. That was a week ago. I haven't gone back since. The memory still lingers. The feeling of being watched, the sounds in the night, the boot prints circling the cabin like a predator stalking its prey. I've told myself it was probably a trespasser or a hunter who didn't expect anyone to be there, but part of me knows it was more than that. What scares me most is the realization that I was completely alone, vulnerable, and at the mercy of whoever or whatever was out there. No ghosts, no monsters, just a person or people with unknown intentions, hiding in the woods and waiting. I still have the bundle of sticks. I keep it in a box in my closet. Sometimes, late at night, I take it out and look at it. It reminds me that nature isn't always peaceful, and sometimes the real danger doesn't come from the wild. It comes from other humans. I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. After months of constant noise, crowded streets, and the non-stop hum of city life, I finally decided to escape somewhere quiet, somewhere isolated enough to unplug entirely. The cabin was tucked deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town or gas station, a place where the only sounds should be the wind through the trees, the crackle of a fire, and maybe the occasional bird or animal passing through. I had imagined peaceful days of hiking and evenings spent staring into the fire, away from the world. The drive out there was longer than I expected. The roads became narrower and rougher, eventually turning to gravel, then dirt, and finally a barely visible path through thick trees. I kept the car in low gear, gripping the wheel tightly as the sun started to set and the shadows lengthened. There was no cell service. I made a mental note of that but wasn't worried. This was exactly the kind of place I wanted. No distractions. The cabin was small and old, but solid. Weathered wood, a stone chimney, and windows so grimy I could barely see inside. The door creaked as I opened it, sending a wave of stale air toward me. Inside, the cabin smelled of damp wood, old smoke, and something faintly musty, like years of closed-up space. It was dusty, but not filthy, and I could see the remnants of someone else's last visit. An empty coffee mug on the counter, a half-used candle, a bundle of firewood stacked neatly in the corner. I dropped my backpack by the door and opened the windows to let in fresh air. Outside, the sun was dipping below the trees, casting long, orange streaks of light through the forest. I found some dry kindling in the woodpile and started a fire in the stone fireplace. The flames caught quickly, crackling and popping as the cabin began to warm. Night came fast. Without streetlights or passing cars, the forest outside was an impenetrable blackness, broken only by the flickering light from the fire. I sat on the old wooden chair, wrapped in a blanket, listening to the sounds of the woods. At first, it was peaceful. The gentle rustle of leaves, distant animal calls, the occasional snap of a twig. But as the minutes passed, I realized how unfamiliar and tense the silence was. Felt like the forest was watching, waiting. I checked my supplies. Enough food and water for a few days, a flashlight with fresh batteries, a small knife in my belt, and a fully charged power bank for my phone. Even though there was no signal, I wasn't entirely alone. The cabin was off the grid, but it had been built on a well-used trail, and a ranger station was about 10 miles away. Not close enough for comfort, but close enough to give me some reassurance. I made myself a simple dinner on the small propane stove in the kitchen, heating canned beans and rice, pouring coffee from the thermos. The kitchen was cramped and old, but functional. The cabinets rattled slightly as I moved, and the floorboards creaked underfoot. It was the kind of place where you could hear every little noise, which only made the silence outside more intense. After eating, I wrote a few notes in my journal. I always liked recording my thoughts, especially in places like this. It helped me stay grounded. Then I settled by the fire with a book, but my eyes kept drifting toward the windows. The darkness outside felt alive. Not in a supernatural way, just in the way deep forests do when you're alone. The kind of darkness that makes your skin crawl. Around midnight, the wind picked up. It howled softly through the trees, and the cabin shuddered with every gust. The fire flickered and threatened to die, so I added more wood. I heard something then, a faint, slow tapping on the outside wall near the back of the cabin. At first, I thought it might be a branch blown against the wood, but the tapping was deliberate, rhythmic. 3 quick knocks, pause, 3 quick knocks again. My heart rate quickened. I grabbed the flashlight and moved cautiously toward the door. I shone the beam outside into the blackness, but there was nothing there. No sign of animals, no people, just the trees swaying in the wind. I convinced myself it was nothing but the weather or a loose branch. Still, the feeling in my gut was uneasy. I locked the door behind me and closed the windows, double-checking the deadbolt. My mind raced through worst-case scenarios, but none seemed likely. No roads nearby, no neighbors, no visible cabins within a mile or two. If someone was out there, they would have to have walked a long way through the woods in the dark. And why would anyone come knocking at a random cabin so late at night? I went back to the chair by the fire, trying to calm down. My hands shook a little. I told myself I was overthinking, that the woods just made my imagination run wild. I kept the knife on the chair beside me, just in case. I didn't sleep much that night. Every creak, every whisper of wind made me jolt awake. Morning came reluctantly, the sky a pale gray behind the dense canopy. I stepped outside to clear my head. The forest was quiet again, the wind gone, the trees still. The ground near the cabin was littered with dry leaves, broken twigs, and the footprints of small animals. I looked carefully for any signs of human presence. Nothing. No footprints, no discarded items, no broken branches that might indicate someone had been near. I spent the day hiking nearby trails, trying to keep busy and calm my nerves. The woods were beautiful in the daylight. Tall pines, moss-covered rocks, and a creek that gurgled gently as it ran over smooth stones. The fresh air was invigorating, and I felt some of the tension ease from my shoulders. Still, I noticed a few odd things. A snapped branch here, a flattened patch of grass there. Nothing that seemed like a real threat, but enough to remind me I wasn't alone. Back at the cabin that evening, I started a bigger fire and prepared a more substantial meal. The night was colder than I expected, the temperature dipping well below freezing. The cabin's single-pane windows did little to keep out the chill, and the wooden floorboards felt like ice under my socks. I layered on clothes and huddled close to the fire. As I stared into the flames, I tried to shake off the creeping dread that settled in my chest. Then, without warning, I heard it again. The slow tapping on the cabin's wall. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks. This time it was louder and more insistent. I didn't want to look, didn't want to move, but I knew I had to. My hands were trembling when I grabbed the flashlight and stepped outside. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees and shadows. The tapping stopped. I circled the cabin, shining the light along the walls, around the corners, behind bushes. No movement, no sign of anything or anyone. Only the cold night air and the distant howl of a coyote. I didn't want to stay out there long, so I went back inside, locking the door and windows behind me again. That night, I barely slept. I lay awake, listening for any noise, gripping the knife like a lifeline. The tapping didn't return, but every sound seemed amplified. The drip of water from the leaky roof, the whistle of wind through the cracks in the walls, the groan of the old wood settling. The next morning, I woke early, still shaken but determined not to let fear ruin the trip. I packed some supplies, intending to hike toward the ranger station to check in and maybe call someone. The thought of being completely cut off made me feel vulnerable. As I stepped outside, the cold air hit my face sharply. The sun was just rising, casting long shadows through the trees. I noticed something on the ground near the back of the cabin. A small pile of stones arranged in a rough circle. I hadn't seen them before. The stones were dirty, damp, and oddly placed, like a marker or a sign. I stared at the circle, trying to make sense of it. Someone must have put it there. But why? There were no footprints or other clues nearby. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. I moved quickly toward the trail, keeping my eyes on the underbrush. The hike was long and tiring, but the sun helped lift my spirits. When I finally reached the ranger station, I found the door locked and no one around. A sign indicated the station was closed for the season. I was more isolated than ever. On the way back, I took a different path, one less traveled but shorter. The woods were quiet except for the occasional bird and the rustling of leaves beneath my boots. As I rounded a bend near a small clearing, I caught sight of something ahead. A figure crouched by the trail, dressed in dark clothing, motionless. I froze. The figure didn't move. There was no face visible, just a shadow against the trees. For a moment, my heart stopped. Then the figure stood and disappeared silently into the forest. I hurried back to the cabin, adrenaline pushing me faster. When I reached the door, I checked the locks and barred them with a sturdy wooden beam I found inside. My breath came in short gasps. The idea that someone had been watching me, lurking so close, unsettled me deeply. That night, I didn't start a fire. The wood was damp and I wanted to conserve energy. I sat in the darkness, listening for footsteps or whispers. Every snap of a twig or brush. I never thought a simple weekend away would turn into something I'd never forget. I was looking for a break from everything. Work, people, the constant noise of the city. Just a quiet cabin in the woods, some fresh air, and a chance to reset. What I got was something much darker, much more real than I had expected. The plan was straightforward. Drive out of town Friday afternoon, reach the cabin by early evening, unpack, start a fire, and just enjoy the silence. The cabin was in a remote part of the Appalachian foothills, nestled deep in the forest, miles from the nearest town. It was exactly what I thought I needed. The drive itself was uneventful. The roads narrowed as I left the highway, winding between thick stands of pine and oak trees. The sky was clear, the sun dropping behind the hills, casting long shadows across the land. The only sounds were the tires humming on the asphalt and the occasional rustle of wind in the trees. As I got closer, the pavement gave way to gravel, then to dirt. The forest thickened, the trees pressing in like a living wall. When I pulled up in front of the cabin, the last light was fading fast. The cabin sat on a small clearing surrounded by towering trees. It was a modest wooden structure, maybe 500 square feet, with a simple porch and a stone chimney. The wood was dark and weathered, but the place looked solid. No power, no running water, just the basics. Exactly what I wanted. I grabbed my bags and stepped inside. The air was cool and smelled like old wood and damp earth. The inside was sparse but cozy. A small kitchen corner with a sink, the water came from a well, a wood stove in the main room, a table and 2 chairs, and a small bed pushed against the far wall. A lantern hung by the door, and there was a stack of firewood neatly piled near the stove. I dropped my bags, unpacked some essentials, and set about getting a fire going. The wood was dry, stacked in a neat pile on the porch and a larger stack inside the cabin. The fire took quickly, and soon a warm glow filled the room. The crackling of the fire was comforting, a steady, natural noise that felt like a shield against the darkness outside. I ate a quick dinner, canned beans heated on the stove and a crust of bread, then settled down on the bed with a book. The quiet was deep, almost total, interrupted only by the occasional snap of the fire and the distant call of a night bird or the rustle of leaves. It was around 10 p.m. when I first noticed something wasn't right. The cabin door was locked. I was sure of it, but every now and then, I thought I heard a faint creak, like the door moving just a little bit. At first, I told myself it was the wind or the old wood settling. The forest was alive with sounds at night, twigs snapping underfoot, animals scurrying, branches brushing together. But this was different. It was too deliberate, too steady, almost like someone was testing the lock or pushing against the door from outside. I got up and checked. The door was locked tight. No sign of anything or anyone outside. The window shutters were closed. I looked around the cabin carefully. No footprints on the porch or in the dirt nearby. The ground was dry but soft enough to hold prints if anyone had been there recently. Nothing. Still, the sound came again. A slow creak followed by a faint thud. I went to the window and peered out. The moon was out, shining through the trees and casting silvery light on the forest floor. The shadows moved, but only because of the wind. No one was there. I told myself it was just nerves. I was alone out here, miles from any help. It was easy to imagine things, but the feeling lingered. Something was off. I went back to bed and tried to read, but my eyes kept flicking to the door and windows. Then I heard it again, footsteps. Light, careful footsteps on the gravel outside. Not far, maybe 20 feet from the cabin. They circled slowly, like someone was pacing. The sound was muffled, but clear enough to make my blood run cold. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, shining the beam into the woods. Nothing. No shapes, no movement. The forest looked empty, still. The only sound was the distant howl of a coyote. I sat back down on the porch, heart pounding. The cold night air made the hairs on my arms stand up. I tried to convince myself it was just some animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but it didn't feel right. The steps were too slow, too human. I locked the door again, checked the windows, and sat inside near the fire, the flashlight resting on the table. Hours passed, each minute stretching longer than the last. The sounds outside faded, but I couldn't relax. Morning finally came, pale and gray. I stepped outside to look around. The ground was dry, no footprints visible near the cabin. I walked a little deeper into the woods, looking for any sign of whoever might have been near during the night. Nothing but the usual forest debris, leaves, pine needles, broken twigs. I stayed in the cabin most of the day, gathering more firewood, cooking a little, reading, trying to shake off the unease. The sun filtering through the trees made the place seem peaceful again. The noises of the forest during the day were normal. Birds, squirrels, the wind through the leaves. But as evening came again, the shadows deepened, and the sense of being watched returned. That night was worse. Around 9 p.m., I heard it again, footsteps outside. This time they were closer, not pacing, but slow and deliberate, moving around the cabin. Then a soft thud on the roof. A single heavy knock. I froze. No one should be up here. No one should be near this place. I grabbed the flashlight and a heavy branch from the firewood pile. The beam cut through the darkness, but the trees swallowed the light. No shapes, no movement. The only sound was the beating of my own heart. Then, from the woods behind the cabin, I heard another noise, something scraping, like nails or claws against bark. I swung the flashlight in that direction but saw only the black outlines of trees. I backed into the cabin, locked the door, and sat close to the fire, gripping the branch tightly. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I decided to hike out and check the road. Maybe I could leave early, cut the trip short. I packed some water and food and walked the narrow trail back toward the main road. The forest felt different in the daylight. The canopy let in beams of sunlight that danced on the forest floor. Birds called overhead, and the smell of pine and damp earth filled my nostrils. I tried to focus on that, the beauty of the woods, but the memory of last night's noises stayed with me. When I reached the dirt road, I stopped and looked back the way I'd come. The trees closed in, a dense green wall. No signs of movement. I thought I was safe. But then, at the edge of the clearing near the cabin, I noticed something strange. The ground was disturbed. Flattened grass, some broken branches, and footprints. Large, booted footprints. They were fresh, maybe hours old. They circled the clearing, stopping at the back of the cabin and then moving off into the woods. That's when I realized I wasn't alone out there. Someone had been watching me all along. I hurried back to the cabin, heart racing. The sun was still high, but the shadows seemed longer now, more menacing. I locked the door, boarded up the windows with some old wooden planks I found in the shed nearby, and tried to think. I didn't have a phone signal. No cell service out here at all. No way to call for help. If someone wanted to get inside, I was trapped. That night was the worst. I sat up all night listening. The footsteps came again, slow and deliberate. Around midnight, I heard the sound of a rock hitting the window, a dull thud followed by silence. I didn't dare look outside. At dawn, the footsteps stopped. I waited all day, staying inside, barely eating, barely moving. When night came, there was no sound. I slept a few hours, waking up tired but relieved. The next morning, I packed my bags quickly, took the trail back to the road, and didn't look back. It was only when I was safely back in town, sitting in a crowded coffee shop with my phone working again, that I told myself I was lucky. I had no idea who had been outside my cabin that weekend or what they wanted, but I knew I didn't want to find out. Sometimes the scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters. They're real people, real threats. The wilderness is beautiful but also unforgiving. Being alone out there means trusting your instincts and being prepared. But no amount of preparation stops the fear when you realize you're being watched by someone with unknown intentions. I never went back to that cabin. I packed up all my gear and found a cabin closer to town after that. One with neighbors nearby and at least a faint phone signal. Because some silence is dangerous, and some quiet isn't peace at all. I never thought I'd be the kind of person who would be caught off guard by something like this. I've always been the type to plan every detail, pack every tool, and expect the worst. But something about that weekend at the cabin broke all my usual caution. And by the end, I realized how fragile we really are when we're alone in the wilderness. I've always liked cabins. Growing up, my family had a small one up in the mountains where we would go in the summer. It wasn't fancy or modern, just a small wooden structure nestled between pine trees with a creek nearby. When I finally had a chance to escape the city, I wanted to get back to that kind of place. Somewhere quiet, somewhere that forced you to unplug from everything. My plan was simple. I'd take 3 days off work, drive to a remote cabin I'd rented, hike around, read some books, maybe fish a little, and come back feeling refreshed. I arrived late afternoon on a Friday, just as the sun was starting to dip behind the hills. The drive was long, and the last 20 miles were on a rough dirt road that bounced the car up and down. I kept thinking I'd see someone else, some other campers or weekend travelers, but the road was empty except for a few deer crossing at odd moments. I rolled down the windows for the fresh mountain air, and even though the sun was setting, the air had a crispness I hadn't felt in months. The cabin sat at the end of a small clearing, surrounded by thick woods. It looked like it had been built decades ago. Simple logs, a small porch, and a stone chimney. It wasn't fancy, but it was sturdy and clean enough. I grabbed my backpack and gear, locked the car, and made my way inside. Inside was basic but comfortable. There was a small kitchen with a wood stove, a table with a couple of chairs, and a bed in the corner covered by a thick quilt. A bookshelf held a handful of old paperbacks, mostly mystery novels and nature guides. I unpacked slowly, making sure to get my sleeping bag and supplies ready. The only thing missing was electricity, but that was part of the plan. I brought a couple of lanterns and extra batteries, so I was covered. After a quick bite of canned beans and crackers, I built a fire in the wood stove. The warmth filled the small cabin, pushing out the chill from outside. I sat by the window, watching the last light fade from the sky. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. That first night, I slept well. The silence was so complete. I could hear the subtle creaks of the cabin settling and the faint rustling of leaves outside. There was no cell signal, but I wasn't worried. I had told a few friends where I was going and when I'd be back, so I felt safe enough. The next day, I woke up early and went for a hike. There was a trailhead just a few hundred feet from the cabin, winding through thick forest and eventually leading to a small lake I'd read about in the rental description. The woods were dense, full of tall pines and moss-covered rocks. Birds sang intermittently, and the ground was soft beneath my boots from last week's rain. I moved slowly, taking in the smells and sounds of the forest. The lake was even more beautiful than I expected. A quiet, glassy surface reflecting the overcast sky, surrounded by tall trees leaning close as if to shelter it. I sat on a fallen log for a long while, eating a granola bar and sipping water from my bottle. The air was cool, almost cold, even though it was early October. I felt a calm settle over me. Back at the cabin, I prepared some stew and started another fire. The day passed quietly. As evening came, I noticed something odd. A faint smell, almost like burning rubber or something chemical. It wasn't strong, but it was definitely there. I looked around the clearing but saw no smoke or anything unusual. I shrugged it off, assuming it must be from the nearby road or some distant campfire. That night was colder than the first. The temperature dropped sharply, and the wind picked up, rattling the cabin's shutters. I bundled up in my sleeping bag and kept the fire going, but the cold crept in through the cracks around the door and windows. Still, I slept, though less deeply. On the third day, I woke up to a strange noise outside. It was subtle, like a faint scraping or dragging sound coming from somewhere in the woods around the cabin. I sat still, listening. The sound came again, slow, irregular, like something heavy being pulled across the ground. I didn't move. The forest was silent again. I decided to stay inside most of the day, reading from one of the books on the shelf. It was a true crime story about a missing hiker, which seemed fitting now. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air felt heavier, thicker somehow. Late afternoon, I went outside to check the perimeter. The ground was soft from rain, and I noticed some marks in the dirt near the back of the cabin. They looked like tire tracks, but oddly shallow and half-smudged, as if someone had driven a small ATV or dirt bike but not recently. The tracks led toward the woods and disappeared. I followed them cautiously. The woods were denser back there, and the underbrush scratched at my pants. After a few minutes, I found an old dirt path that looked like it hadn't been used much in years. But I heard the scraping noise again, this time closer. I froze and scanned the tree line. Then I saw it. A figure. Not a person, at least not fully. It was hunched over, moving awkwardly through the trees, dragging something heavy behind it. The figure wore a dark jacket, and I could see the outline of a rifle slung across its back. Its face was obscured by a hood, and it moved slowly, carefully, almost like it didn't want to be seen. I ducked behind a tree and held my breath. The figure stopped nearby and looked around, then disappeared deeper into the woods, dragging the heavy object behind. My heart was pounding. I backed away slowly, careful not to make noise. I didn't know what to do. I thought about running back to the cabin, but I didn't want to lead this person to where I was staying. When I got back to the cabin, I locked the doors and windows and pushed a heavy chair against the front door. I checked my phone again, still no signal. My mind raced. What was that person doing out here? Why were they dragging something heavy? The whole area was supposed to be quiet, deserted except for me. That night was the worst. I stayed awake nearly all night, staring into the dark woods through the small windows, listening for any sound. The scraping noise came and went, sometimes close, sometimes far. I could hear footsteps and faint voices, muffled and low. I kept my knife nearby and a flashlight loaded. At one point, I thought I saw a shadow moving across the clearing, just beyond the edge of the firelight I'd managed to keep alive in the stove. I didn't dare open the door or shout. I just sat frozen, gripping my knife. Morning came slowly, The sun's first rays lit up the forest, and I finally felt some relief. I knew I couldn't stay inside forever, but I was scared to leave, scared of what was lurking outside. After some thought, I decided to pack up and leave right away. I threw my gear into my backpack, doused the fire, and slipped on my boots. I stepped outside carefully, scanning the area. The tire tracks from before were clearer now, and more fresh ones had appeared, circling the cabin like a slow spiral. There were also footprints, heavy boots that came right up to the cabin walls. I could see dirt and mud smeared against the logs, as if someone had leaned or pressed against them. I took a deep breath and started walking down the dirt road toward my car, which I'd parked a little distance away. Every crunch of leaves or twig made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that figure again. About halfway to the car, I found something chilling. Scattered along the road were bits of torn fabric and broken branches. Then I saw it, a bloodied piece of clothing like a sleeve or a torn jacket corner. My stomach dropped. What had happened here? Was the person I'd seen hurt, or had they hurt someone else? I didn't want to stop or investigate. I walked faster, practically running, and reached my car. The door was unlocked, which was odd because I was sure I'd locked it. I slipped inside, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I pulled onto the dirt road, I noticed something I hadn't before. At the edge of the clearing near the cabin, there was a freshly dug hole, about 2 feet wide and 3 feet deep. The soil around it was loose and disturbed. I could only imagine what had been buried there. My hands trembled on the steering wheel as I drove. I didn't stop until I reached the main highway, where cell signal finally returned. I called the local sheriff's office and reported what I'd seen: the tracks, the hole, the strange figure. The officers said they would send someone to check it out, but I knew I wouldn't go back there. I packed up my things that night and booked a hotel in the nearest town. Over the next few days, news reports trickled in about an illegal poacher or a drug smuggling operation being busted in the forest nearby. The police had found evidence of someone burying stolen goods and weapons. They also found human remains that were believed to be a missing person from the area. The reports never mentioned a cabin, but I had no doubt they were connected. Looking back, I realize how isolated and vulnerable I was out there. The wilderness may seem peaceful, but when people like that are around, it can become dangerous in ways you don't expect. I've been camping and I'd been looking forward to this trip for months. A quiet weekend away, just me and the cabin deep in the woods. No phone signal, no internet, no distractions. Just the forest, the cold air, and a small wooden cabin I'd rented to myself. It was the perfect place to escape from the city noise and the never-ending buzz of everyday life. The cabin was about a 2-hour drive from the nearest town, tucked into the middle of a national forest. It was an old structure, built decades ago, but well-maintained by the owner. The wooden walls were rough but solid. The windows had thick panes, and the chimney promised warmth for the cold nights ahead. The dirt road leading to it was narrow and winding, bordered by dense pine trees that blocked the sunlight the farther you went. By the time I pulled up, the sun was already dipping low, throwing long shadows across the forest floor. Unpacking was quick. I carried my backpack inside, setting down my supplies: firewood, canned food, a basic first aid kit, and a flashlight with fresh batteries. The cabin was small but cozy. A single main room with a wood stove, a small kitchen area, and a narrow staircase leading to a loft where the bed was. The air smelled like aged wood and something faintly earthy, maybe pine sap or old leaves. I liked that smell. It meant I was far away from the city. Outside, the wind rustled through the branches, and the forest was settling down for the night. I built a fire in the stove, stacking the dry logs carefully, and after a few tries, it caught. The flames threw a warm glow around the room, and I felt myself relax a little. I ate some of the canned food cold, nothing fancy, but enough to settle my stomach, and then pulled out a book I'd brought along. The soft crackling of the fire mixed with the occasional creak of the cabin settling made a quiet background. It wasn't long before the cold started creeping in. Even with the fire, The air outside was dropping quickly as the sun disappeared. I wrapped myself in a thick blanket and climbed up into the loft to lie down. The bed was firm and a little stiff, but better than I expected. I closed my eyes and let the quiet wrap around me. But sleep didn't come easily. Every little noise seemed louder in the stillness. The wind shifted suddenly outside, sending a low howl through the trees. The branches scraped against the window panes, tapping like fingers. At one point, I thought I heard a twig snap somewhere close, but the forest was full of sounds like that. I told myself it was nothing, just the wildlife moving around, maybe a deer or a raccoon. Still, my mind wouldn't let go. I kept thinking about how isolated I was out here. No cell service meant I was completely cut off. If anything happened, I was on my own. The thoughts stuck with me as I tried to settle, the silence weighing heavy like a blanket I couldn't throw off. Around midnight, I woke again. The fire had died down to glowing embers, so I slipped quietly out of bed and went to the stove to add more wood. As I opened the door, the cold air rushed in, biting at my skin. I glanced out the window. The moon was low, a thin sliver barely lighting the dark forest. Then I saw it, a pair of eyes, just beyond the treeline, reflecting a pale yellow glow back at me. They didn't blink or move, just stared. I froze, heart pounding, trying to convince myself it was an animal, maybe a deer caught in the firelight. But the eyes were too steady, too fixed. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it toward where the eyes had been, but the beam only landed on empty trees. The eyes were gone. My heart raced as I backed away from the window, telling myself it was nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The rest of the night passed in uneasy silence. Every shadow in the cabin felt bigger than it was, every sound sharper. I kept the fire burning, feeding it little bits of wood to keep the room warm and the darkness at bay. Morning came with a thin mist hanging low over the forest. I stepped outside, the cold air crisp in my lungs. The world was quiet except for birds starting their day and the soft rustling of leaves. I wandered around the cabin, checking for any signs of whatever had been out there the night before, but found nothing unusual. No footprints, no broken branches, no disturbance. I told myself I was just tired, and maybe my imagination had run wild in the darkness. The next few hours I spent exploring the nearby trails. The forest was beautiful. Tall trees, moss-covered rocks, and fallen leaves crunching under my boots. I walked a few miles, keeping an eye out for wildlife, but saw only squirrels and birds. The peace was comforting, but still, the unease from the night before lingered just under the surface. Back at the cabin that afternoon, I fixed a small lunch and read some more. The sun made the cabin warm, and I could hear the distant sound of a stream trickling nearby. I figured I'd find it if I followed a narrow path behind the cabin later. As evening approached, the temperature dropped again. I started a fire early this time, piling on wood until the flames roared bright. I sat close to the stove, enjoying the warmth, trying to keep my mind busy. It was hard to relax, though. I kept glancing at the windows, expecting to see those eyes again. Hours passed, and I decided to check the perimeter of the cabin before heading to bed. Taking a flashlight, I walked carefully around the building, the beam cutting through the dark. The forest felt different at night, heavier, more closed in. The shadows grew long and sharp, and every sound was louder. As I rounded the back of the cabin, something caught my eye near a tree line. A figure, not an animal, a person. I froze. The figure was hunched, wearing dark clothes that blended into the night. They weren't moving much, just standing still, looking toward the cabin. My heart jumped. I thought about the stories I'd heard, about people who camped alone, only to find others lurking nearby, sometimes with bad intentions. Out here, far from help, the risk was real. I didn't have a phone signal, no way to call for help. My only protection was a small hunting knife in my backpack. The figure didn't move when I stepped closer, shining my light directly at them. Instead, they turned and vanished into the trees without a sound. I hurried back inside, locked the door, and checked every window. Nothing broken, no sign anyone had tried to get in. But my skin felt tight, my hands trembling slightly. I sat by the fire, trying to calm down, reminding myself that maybe it was just a hunter or someone passing through. Still, the thought that someone had been watching me all day and was possibly nearby right now made the cabin feel smaller, less safe. That night was worse than the last. I barely slept, listening to every sound outside. The wind seemed louder. The trees creaked like they were whispering secrets. At one point, I heard footsteps circling the cabin. Slow, deliberate, not fast like an animal running, but careful, measured. I stayed as quiet as I could, holding the knife close. The footsteps faded away after a while, but I didn't dare look outside until dawn. Morning was a relief. The sun broke through the trees, the forest alive again with birdsong. I packed a bag quickly and left the cabin, taking the main dirt road back to my car. I didn't look back. It was only when I was safely on the highway driving away that I realized what might have happened. That figure I'd seen, they had been watching me the whole time. Not out of curiosity, not lost or harmless. They were waiting. Maybe they'd been following the cabin's owner, or maybe they had been hiding in the woods for days. In that remote place, the forest could be dangerous. Not because of monsters or ghosts, but because of people. People who didn't want to be found, who used the isolation to hide bad things. I didn't stop or look back until I reached the town, where cell service came back and I could call for help if I needed. I told the cabin owner about what happened, and they said they'd check the place soon, maybe with a ranger. What stuck with me wasn't just the fear of being watched or the footsteps outside. It was the realization that no matter how beautiful and peaceful a place looks, out there in the wild, you're never truly alone. And sometimes, the scariest thing isn't the dark or the wild animals. It's the people you don't see coming. It was late October when I decided to take a break from everything and spend a few days alone in the woods. I'd been working nonstop for months, caught in a cycle of emails, meetings, and endless city noise. The idea of a cabin far from any road, surrounded by trees and silence, sounded like exactly what I needed to clear my head and recharge. I didn't want any distractions, no phone, no internet, no people. Just me, a book, and the forest. I found a small cabin listed online that seemed perfect. It was about a 3-hour drive from the city, tucked deep in a national forest in a remote area with only a rough dirt road leading to it. The pictures showed a modest wooden cabin, weathered by time but sturdy enough, with a stone chimney and a small porch. The owner said it wasn't often rented, so I'd probably be alone the whole time. That suited me fine. The day I left, the sky was clear, with a pale sun filtering through a thin layer of clouds. The air had that crispness that only early fall has, the kind that hints at winter coming soon. I packed the car carefully, making sure to bring enough food, water, a decent first aid kit, and plenty of firewood. I also grabbed a heavy flashlight and a hunting knife, more because I felt I should than because I expected to need them. The drive to the cabin was long but peaceful. The highway gave way to smaller roads and eventually to that rough dirt path. The car rattled as I bumped over roots and stones. The trees on either side grew taller, thicker, their branches tangled and dark against the dimming sky. By the time I turned the last corner, the cabin came into view, sitting quietly in a small clearing. It looked just like the pictures. Quiet, alone, surrounded by forest. I pulled in and parked near the porch. The first thing I noticed was how still everything was. No birds, no insects buzzing, no distant hum of cars or people. Just silence except for the faint creak of the wind moving through the branches. It was a heavy silence, not peaceful but thick, like the forest was holding its breath. I stepped out of the car, stretched, and unloaded my gear. The cabin smelled of old wood and smoke, probably from the last renters who'd used the fireplace. I spent the next hour unpacking, stacking firewood near the door, and gathering some dry kindling outside. The cabin was simple inside. There was a small living room with a wood stove, a tiny kitchen, a bedroom with a cot, and a small bathroom with cold running water from a well nearby. I started a fire in the stove, careful to get it going before the sun fully set. The warmth felt good after the chill outside. I ate some canned soup, read for a while by the fire, then settled in early. The silence outside was complete now. I could hear the occasional snap of a twig or the rustle of leaves, but no animals, no voices, just the forest breathing around me. I slept fitfully the first night. The cabin creaked as the wind pushed against the walls, and strange shadows moved in the corners of the room. I kept hearing soft sounds outside, branches tapping on the windows, a faint rustle in the underbrush. Every time I opened my eyes, I saw nothing but darkness. I told myself it was just the forest, the wind, my imagination playing tricks. The next morning, I woke to gray light filtering through the small windows. The temperature had dropped overnight, icy cold that made the windows frost at the edges. I dressed quickly, building the fire up again to warm the cabin. Outside, the ground was damp with overnight dew, and the trees looked darker, the forest denser. I decided to hike the trail I'd seen on the map. It started just behind the cabin and wound deeper into the woods. I grabbed my pack with water and snacks and took the old trail, careful with each step over roots and stones. The forest was quiet, almost too quiet. Usually, I would hear birds or squirrels or the chatter of small animals, but here it was just dead silence. No life, just trees and shadows. As I walked, I noticed signs that the area was rarely visited. The trail was overgrown in places, fallen leaves covering parts of it. At one point, I saw an old rusted metal trap half buried in the dirt. That made me pause. I'd never seen traps on public trails before. The thought of someone setting traps nearby unsettled me. I left the trap alone but kept it in mind as I continued. After a couple of miles, the trail led to a small creek. The water was clear but cold, rushing quietly between moss-covered rocks. I filled my water bottle and sat on a fallen log to rest. The forest here felt thicker, darker. The trees leaned in close, their branches intertwined overhead, blocking much of the gray sky. Felt like the forest was closing around me, watching. I didn't stay long and turned back to the cabin. As I walked, I noticed small things that didn't feel right. Broken branches snapped in places where no animals had been. Patches of ground flattened as if something had lain there recently. The silence remained absolute, but the forest seemed more alive somehow. Tense, as if something unseen was moving just out of sight. Back at the cabin, I tried to shake off the feeling. I built a fire, made a simple dinner, and settled in with my book again. Night came quickly, and the cold crept back into the cabin. I wrapped myself in a blanket by the stove, but sleep was hard to find. Outside, I thought I heard faint footsteps crunching leaves, slow and deliberate. I got up several times to check the windows. Nothing. On the third day, I woke early, the fire long dead and the cabin cold. The wind was stronger now, rattling the windows and making the trees groan. I checked my supplies and decided to spend the day cleaning and organizing, trying to keep my mind busy. The forest outside looked wild and unwelcoming under the gray sky. Later, I noticed the batteries in my flashlight were dying faster than they should. I found an extra pack, but that made me uneasy. I had been careful not to waste the batteries, yet somehow they were draining quickly. The idea of being left in the dark out here made my skin crawl. That night, the sounds outside were worse. There were heavy footsteps circling the cabin, slow but steady, as if someone was pacing just out of sight. The shadows seemed to move in unnatural ways, and the wind brought strange noises, low grunts, something like breathing, too heavy and uneven to be the wind. I stayed by the fire, clutching the knife, heart pounding. The next morning, I found something I hadn't expected. My car was missing. I stood on the porch, stunned. The place where I'd parked was empty. The dirt was disturbed, tire tracks leading away into the trees, but no sign of my car anywhere. Couldn't believe it. I searched the area as best as I could, walking along the rough road, but the tracks just disappeared into the woods. Whoever took my car had driven it deep into the forest and abandoned it or hidden it. Panic rose in my chest. I had no way to leave now, no cell service, no way to call for help. I was completely isolated. I went back into the cabin and locked the doors. I checked every window and made sure they were shut tight. I piled more wood on the fire, trying to stay warm and calm. I rationed my food and water carefully, knowing I might be here longer than planned. That day, I spent hours watching the trees outside, eyes scanning the shadows. I was convinced someone was watching me, maybe even waiting for me to make a mistake. I thought about walking out on foot, following the road to find help, but the woods were dense and I had no idea how far it was to civilization. It was October, and nights were already cold. I wasn't prepared to survive on my own in the forest without supplies. Night came again, and with it the noises. This time, the footsteps were joined by something else. Soft tapping on the windows, slow and rhythmic, like someone trying to get my attention. I didn't move, didn't respond. The fire burned low, the cabin growing colder. At one point, I thought I saw a shadow moving just beyond the tree line. It vanished when I looked closer. I didn't want to believe someone was out there, watching and waiting. On the fourth day, I started hearing voices. It wasn't loud, more like murmurs carried on the wind. I wasn't sure if it was real or just my imagination twisting the sounds of the forest. I stayed inside, not wanting to risk seeing who or what might be nearby. The cold was unbearable. The cabin had no heating besides the wood stove, and I was running low on firewood. I wrapped myself in all the clothes I had and tried to stay still, conserving energy. Late in the afternoon, I heard a crash from the woods. Something large breaking branches, moving fast. My heart stopped. I grabbed the knife, ready to defend myself if needed. But no one came to the cabin. The sounds moved away quickly, disappearing into the thick trees. That night was the worst. The footsteps were all around now, circling the cabin like predators stalking prey. The tapping on the windows turned into pounding, hard and relentless. I pulled the curtains closed and wedged a chair against the door. I stayed awake all night, listening to every sound. It was the kind of quiet that feels like it could swallow you whole. The remote summer cabin where my family stayed was perched on a steep hill in the dense forests of northern Sweden. I was 15 at the time, and it was one of those places where the outside world, noise, light, everything, felt miles away. The cabin itself was small and wooden, with simple windows that looked out onto nothing but thick trees, the slope of the hill, and down at the bottom, a small lake. The lake was calm and dark, its surface just reflecting the few stars that peeked out behind the clouds that night. There was a narrow wooden bridge crossing a little inlet, and two small boats tied up along the shore, swaying gently in the stillness. My cousins and I were with our dads, walking down the hill toward the lake just after 9 in the evening. The rest of the family, our grandparents, aunt, and mom, had stayed back in the cabin because it was starting to get chilly, and the night was falling fast. The temperature was dropping too, crisp and sharp in the air, as it often did in the fall. We carried some firewood and matches, and the two dogs, one belonging to my grandparents and the other to my cousins, followed closely behind, their paws soft against the mossy ground. The hill was steep, covered in a thick carpet of pine needles and moss, with the occasional fallen branch snapping underfoot. The trees towered over us, casting long shadows, and their dense branches blocked out most of the remaining daylight. As we got closer to the lake, the smell of damp earth and pine grew stronger. It was one of those smells that felt both comforting and wild at the same time, like the forest was breathing around us. Once at the lake, we built the fire in a small fire pit right near the water's edge. The wood caught quickly, crackling and popping as the flames grew, casting flickering orange light across our faces. We sat down on some fallen logs arranged around the fire, the heat warm against the cooling air. The dogs curled up near the fire, their bodies relaxing but their ears twitching now and then as they listened to the quiet noises of the night. For a while, we just sat there. The conversation started easy, talking about school, the coming winter, plans for next summer. But as the fire burned down to glowing embers, the words slowed and finally stopped. The kind of silence that fell wasn't uncomfortable. It was peaceful, a quiet that made you listen closely to everything. The distant call of a bird settling in for the night, the gentle lap of water against the shore, the soft rustling of leaves far off in the dark woods behind us. But then, Even in that peaceful silence, I started to feel something strange. It was a sensation I hadn't experienced before but instantly recognized. The feeling of being watched. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe it was just my imagination or the way the shadows moved in the firelight. But the feeling stayed, growing heavier, like something unseen was just beyond the edge of the firelight, hiding in the trees behind us. We were all sitting with our backs to the woods, facing the lake, the cabin behind us up the hill out of sight. The woods behind felt thick and impenetrable, the trees so close together they blocked out the stars and the moon. It felt like those trees were holding something, watching us, waiting. Suddenly, out of nowhere, my dad said, "Yes, I'm good." His voice was calm, but everyone turned to look at him in confusion because no one had asked him anything. He glanced toward the cabin, then at my cousin sitting beside him. "Yeah, I'm doing good." My cousin frowned and said, "What? I didn't ask you anything." Dad looked puzzled and then explained something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. He said he felt someone lean over and whisper in his ear. The words were clear in his mind. "Hello, how are you?" And he described feeling warm breath on his neck and a hand on his shoulder. At first, he thought it was my mom, who was supposed to be back at the cabin. So he turned around quickly, but there was no one there. The dogs suddenly snapped to attention, their growls deep and low, coming from somewhere just behind my dad, toward the dark woods. They were staring straight into the trees, hackles raised and teeth bared. It was the kind of growl that told you they saw or smelled something no one else could. We all froze, the firelight flickering wildly in the sudden breeze. The silence of the woods felt like it was closing in on us, heavier now, thicker. We could hear something, maybe a branch breaking or leaves shifting, just beyond the fire's glow. No one spoke. We didn't move. After a few long seconds, the dogs barked sharply, and we grabbed the remaining embers of the fire and stomped them out fast. The warmth vanished, and the darkness seemed to close over us like a blanket. We ran, fast, stumbling up the hill toward the cabin, hearts pounding so hard it felt like they'd burst. The dogs stayed close, barking and snarling as they ran. Back inside the cabin, with the door locked tight behind us, everything felt different. The windows showed nothing but blackness, the forest swallowed by night. The dogs paced, restless, while we stood silent, each one of us trying to process what had happened. For the rest of the trip, we didn't go outside after dark. We stayed close to the fire inside, the cold air pressing against the windows. Sometimes, when the wind blew just right, I thought I could hear the faintest sound from the woods, like someone breathing, watching, waiting. That night and the feeling it gave me stuck with me for years. What it was, I can't say for sure. There was no shadowy figure, no strange lights, no footprints. Just a voice that wasn't there, a touch that shouldn't have been, and dogs that saw something real beyond our eyes. When I look back, I think it was something natural, something from the woods itself, a wild animal maybe, or something human that wanted to watch but not be seen. The feeling of being watched wasn't from fear or danger alone. It was curiosity, too. Whatever it was didn't want to hurt us that night. It just wanted to be noticed. The cabin sits there still, on that hill, surrounded by trees that hold their secrets tight. I haven't gone back to sit by the lake after dark since. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still feel the heat of the fire, the cool air on my skin, and that quiet, watchful presence just beyond the trees. The first thing I should say is this is all real. Every bit of it. I'm not making any of this up, even if it sounds crazy. I'm telling it exactly how it happened because the truth matters, and because if anyone else ever ends up in the same situation, maybe this can help them. Or at least warn them. I'm a guy who likes the outdoors. I'm not some expert woodsman or survivalist, but I know how to camp, hike, and enjoy being away from the city. That's why I agreed to go on this trip to a remote cabin in Colorado with my fiancé and a couple of friends. The cabin belonged to a friend of mine who disappeared a year before, and part of the reason we went was to figure out what happened. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, some fresh air, hiking, and maybe some answers. I never expected it would turn into one of the scariest experiences of my life. We arrived late afternoon on a Friday, driving up a narrow, twisting dirt road. The forest was dense with pines and firs, the smell sharp and clean in the air. The sun was warm but starting to dip behind the peaks. The cabin itself was small, made of weathered logs that had darkened over the years. It sat near the edge of a clearing, backed by thick trees on three sides. From the outside, it looked abandoned, but it was solid and the windows were intact. There was no electricity or cell signal, but the place had a wood stove and basic supplies inside. We unloaded our gear and started a fire in the stone pit out front. I stacked logs carefully, the crackling flames casting long shadows across the clearing. My fiancée and our two friends helped set up the tents just a few yards from the cabin, and we all felt excited. We didn't know what was waiting for us inside that cabin, but we hoped for clues. That first night, the temperature dropped fast. It was mid-fall, but the mountains had already started to taste winter. I layered on every piece of clothing I had, and still the cold crept into my bones. The fire was our only warmth. We sat close, eating canned stew warmed over the flames. My mind kept drifting back to our missing friend. Where was he? What had happened? The next day, we started hiking up a trail that led to a nearby cave system my missing friend was last seen exploring. The trail was steep and rocky, twisting through the forest with patches of frost glinting underfoot. The cave was dark and damp, a deep hole in the mountainside with jagged rocks forming a rough entrance. We didn't go inside. Something about the place felt off. The air was colder there, almost unnaturally so. When we returned to the cabin, things began to change. First, it was small stuff. A door left unlocked when we were sure we'd closed it. Our firewood, stacked neatly by the cabin door, would be scattered the next morning. We'd hear sounds outside, branches snapping, footsteps crunching on the frozen leaves. But when we looked out, no one was there. The dogs we brought along were uneasy, growling low and refusing to come near the edge of the clearing. On the third night, I woke up suddenly, sweating despite the cold. Something was wrong. I could hear faint noises outside, a dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled through the underbrush. I grabbed my flashlight and quietly crept outside. The forest was still and dark. The moon was behind clouds, so all I had was the beam from my flashlight cutting through the black. I scanned the trees, my breath misting in the cold air. Suddenly, the light caught on something reflective near the cabin door. A silver chain, glinting faintly. I had no idea whose it was. The cabin had been empty for months. We hadn't seen any other people around. I pocketed the chain and went back inside, locking the door behind me. The others were still asleep, unaware. The next morning, I told my fiancée and the others what I found. We decided to search the cabin carefully. That's when we noticed strange marks carved into the wood above the doors. Rough scratches that looked like symbols, but nothing we could understand. Then we found footprints in the dirt just outside the clearing. Not human, at least not any human I recognized. They were large, with long toes spread wide, and the prints sank deep into the soft earth. My friend who grew up hunting told me they looked like something that walked barefoot, but not like any bear or known animal. We couldn't explain it. That afternoon, as we gathered firewood, I noticed the dogs had disappeared. We called them, shouted their names, but they didn't come. Later, we found one of them at the edge of the forest, trembling and refusing to go back near the cabin. I started to feel like we were being watched. By the time night fell, the cold was brutal. The wind howled through the trees and the fire barely kept the chill at bay. I stayed awake most of the night, staring into the dark forest beyond the firelight. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just a shadow between the trees. Tall, thin, and moving slowly. Not quite human in shape. The limbs looked too long and the way it moved was unnatural, like something stalking its prey. I shined my flashlight toward it, but the beam seemed to pass through the figure like it wasn't really there. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed into the cabin and locked the door again. We decided not to mention it to the others, not wanting to scare them. But I knew whatever was out there was dangerous. The days after, things got worse. The strange marks above the doors deepened, as if someone or something was scratching them overnight. The silver chain I found disappeared from my pocket, even though I never took it off. Our food started vanishing from inside the cabin, and we found large footprints circling the cabin in the snow. I read online about local legends. There were stories about creatures called Wendigo or Wendigo in northern forests. Mostly up north, true, but some told tales of similar beings in the Rockies. I brushed it off at first, but the more I thought about it, the more the stories matched what we were experiencing. A creature stalking and hunting humans, with long limbs, unnatural strength, and an aversion to silver. It sounded crazy, but I had no other explanation. One night, around midnight, the worst happened. The fire was almost dead, just a few glowing embers left. My fiancé and the others were asleep in their tents, leaving me alone in the cabin. Suddenly, I heard a loud crashing at the back door. It sounded like something heavy smashing against the wood. I grabbed the only weapon I had, a small hunting knife, and crept to the door. My hands were shaking. Outside, the air was freezing, and I could see breath fogging in the light of the full moon. Then I saw the shadow again, closer this time. It crouched low like a predator, staring at me with eyes that glinted faintly red in the dark. I raised the knife and, without thinking, threw a handful of silver coins I'd brought on a whim from my pocket toward it. The creature hissed and recoiled, retreating into the forest with a sound like branches snapping violently. I slammed the door shut and locked it again, heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The next day, I searched for silver objects in the cabin and around the clearing. There were some old coins in a box, a silver locket my fiancé had brought, and a few silver spoons in the kitchen drawer. We hung them all above the doors and windows. That night, we all wore silver rings and bracelets. We kept the fire burning high and stayed together in the cabin. For 2 days, nothing happened. The footprints disappeared. The scratching on the cabin stopped. The air felt warmer, but we knew it wasn't gone, just waiting. When it was time to leave, we packed quickly, eager to get out. We drove back down the winding road in silence, all of us shaken. Back home, we visited a shaman, someone recommended by a friend who worked with native healers. She performed a cleansing ritual at our place, blessing the house, our bodies, and our spirits. She told us that creatures like what we encountered are real, born from desperation and hunger in the wild, but they can attach themselves to humans, tracking them home. She warned us to stay vigilant, to keep silver close, and to avoid places like the cave and cabin. It's been months since then. We never went back. The cabin was sold and torn down. But sometimes, late at night, I still feel eyes watching me. When I'm alone, I check for the silver ring on my finger. I carry a small silver knife now, not because I believe in magic, but because it makes me feel safer. I know what we saw was real, something out there beyond our understanding, but terrifyingly physical. No ghosts, no stories, just something alive, hungry, and dangerous. If you ever find yourself near an abandoned cabin in the woods with strange marks, disappearing animals, and cold that bites deep, don't ignore the signs. And if you hear scratching on your doors at night, make sure you've got something silver close at hand. Because sometimes the monsters aren't legends. They're waiting just outside the door. The cabin waited, patient as stone and cold as the earth beneath it. It had stood here for longer than most could imagine, nestled deep in the dense woods where sunlight barely filtered through the thick canopy. Its timber frame, worn and scarred, whispered of years untouched by human hands, until tonight. The air was heavy with damp, and a chill had settled in the bones of the forest, seeping into the cracks of the cabin's ancient walls. It was hungry, always waiting. I was born of wood and nails, formed from the trees that had fallen long ago, but life had never truly stirred within me until they came. The trespassers who sought shelter from the cold, from the storm, from their own fears. I watched them approach, their boots crunching over dead leaves, their voices quiet and nervous. They carried light and fire, fragile weapons against the dark. They did not know me. They did not know what I was. I stretched my fingers. Creaking beams, shifting floorboards, whispering walls, welcoming them inside with an eerie invitation. The door groaned as it swung open, and they stepped into my hollow belly. They were cautious, tired, drawn to the warmth of the fire they built. They settled in, unknowing and vulnerable, their bodies curling close to the flames. Their breaths came in shallow waves, misting in the frigid air. Perfect. I fed on more than just wood and ash. The hunger inside me was deeper, darker. It grew with each passing moment, a gnawing ache that could only be sated by flesh and fear. They did not sense the slow shifting beneath their feet, the floor's subtle tightening, the walls drawing closer like fingers ready to grasp. They were prey, and I was the trap. The night deepened. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, rattling the windows and sending leaves scuttling across the porch. Inside, the fire sputtered, shadows dancing on the walls. The newcomers grew restless. One moved towards the door, but the handle chilled her fingers, cold as ice, refusing to turn. Panic whispered in their eyes, but their voices stayed silent. Fear was a language I knew well. I let the darkness press in, swallowing their hopes. The floor beneath one groaned and cracked, splitting open like a wound to reveal the trap below. She stumbled, and the air filled with the raw sound of terror as she fell, swallowed by the cabin's hungry mouth. Her screams echoed but were quickly muted by the thick timber that trapped her beneath. The others tried to flee, but the walls twisted subtly, narrowing the exit. Panic turned to chaos. They hammered on the door, but it refused to budge. The windows were sealed tight, their glass clouded with frost. The cabin was no longer a refuge, it was a prison. Hunger pulsed in every beam, every plank, feeding on their rising terror. They scrambled to find another way out, but the cabin had already claimed them. Slowly, methodically, the fire died to embers. The room plunged into cold darkness. I tasted their fear, sweet and sharp, and it fed the hunger deep inside. The cabin was alive in a way they could not understand, not with breath or blood, but with the endless hunger of wood and stone. I would wait, always, for the next foolish souls who thought they could find safety within these walls. That night marked the beginning of a slow, terrible cycle. I have been here for decades, if not centuries, and I remember every visitor who has stepped inside, seeking warmth or shelter. They come, they stay, they falter, and they are consumed, not always in the way one might expect, but always in the way the cabin demands. The walls breathe with a quiet menace. Floorboards shift, ceiling beams creak and stretch, and the fireplace pulses with a subtle life. The hunger is constant and raw. It waits for that moment of weakness when a soul lets their guard down, when they believe they are safe, and then it strikes. The cabin is a predator disguised as a home. It has no eyes, but it sees everything. It has no mouth, but it devours relentlessly. Over the years, I have learned how to trap them, how to make them stay when they want to leave. Sometimes the door locks itself, sometimes the stairs collapse, sometimes the very walls shift to block escape. There is no need for haste. The cabin is patient. Some try to fight, but I am not a thing they can break. I am rooted deep in the earth, stronger than their bodies, and colder than their souls. My hunger is eternal, and my appetite grows with every soul that enters. Sometimes the fire is kind, offering warmth and comfort to lure them in, but it is a cruel kindness. The heat dries the sweat of fear, making their skin tight and brittle. The cold that follows, creeping through the floor and walls, is a slow death. I remember one night, long ago, when a group came seeking refuge from a storm. They were loud and careless at first, lighting candles and singing songs to keep their spirits up. But the storm outside was relentless, battering the cabin with wind and rain. The fire flickered, and the temperature dropped. The candles sputtered and died. One by one, their lights went out, swallowed by darkness. They huddled close, trembling. The cabin listened, then moved. A floorboard shifted beneath one, breaking away to reveal a pit filled with sharp stones. He fell, screaming silently as the walls absorbed his cries. The others tried to hold together, but the cabin's hunger was too strong. It seeped into their bones, sapping their strength and will. The last one left tried to escape through a broken window, but the glass was sharp and unforgiving. He cut himself badly, blood soaking into the wood, feeding the hunger deeper. He ran, stumbling through the woods, but the cold night was no friend. He was found days later, frozen in the snow, his mind broken by fear and cold. The cabin waits for no one, but it remembers every moment. The hunger inside me is not like hunger for food or drink. It is a slow, patient craving that grows with every heartbeat, every breath, every flicker of fear. It is a hunger for life, for the pulse of something warm and fragile against my cold walls. I can feel it in their presence, their scent, sweat, fear, heat, all calling to me like a siren's song. When they enter, I offer comfort. The door opens easily, the fire is warm, the air feels safe. I want them to think they are home because once they believe that, their guard falls. That is when the hunger strikes. It starts with small things. The floor creaks underfoot, the shadows stretch a little longer, the temperature dips a little more than it should. They hear noises, feel eyes where no one is. The fire sputters. The door won't open. The cabin tightens around them like a trap. And then I take. Sometimes it is a finger caught in a doorframe, a sudden fall down a broken stair, a quiet collapse into the darkness beneath the floor. Sometimes it is the cold, creeping into bones and mind until they break. There is no mercy here, only hunger and the slow, inevitable end. The woods outside grow quiet as the cabin feasts. The birds stop singing, the wind stills, the forest holds its breath. And when the hunger is sated, I rest. The door creaks closed, the fire dies, and the cold seeps back in. The cabin returns to its patient waiting. I have been studied and sought out. Hunters and thrill seekers come with cameras and plans, eager to uncover secrets or prove legends. They do not last long. The cabin does not care for their tools or technology. It waits, watching and listening. One man tried to barricade the door with heavy logs. It made no difference. The logs creaked and groaned, then shifted apart, as if alive. The door opened anyway, and he disappeared inside. Another woman left markings on the walls, hoping to track her path, but they faded overnight, swallowed by the wood. No one has ever escaped once the hunger wakes. On cold nights, when the wind blows just right, the cabin hums softly. It is a song of hunger and patience, of darkness waiting beneath warm light. It is a promise that nothing escapes forever. The cabin is always hungry. I wait still. Tonight, the wind has shifted. Footsteps approach along the gravel path, hesitant and weary. They carry light and fire, fragile hopes. The door creaks open. The hunger stirs. The cabin waits. The hunger will be fed. The forest falls silent again. For the last 4 winters, I've been living out of my van, parking in the same working-class neighborhood in Oakland where I first landed years ago. It's a little slice of familiarity amid all the chaos, a patch of ground where a handful of friends know me, and an even larger number of people recognize the van and the guy who's been coming back every year. I was a federal wildland firefighter before the pandemic hit, and even though that job had its own kind of intensity and risk, nothing quite prepared me for the strange, creeping fear that settles in when you're isolated in a small space surrounded by a city that's changing faster than you can keep up. I keep my van close to 580, near the streets where crews roll through at night checking handles, making their rounds. It's noisy sometimes, but it's safer than the quieter streets, where the shadows seem to stretch longer. I keep an 18-inch crowbar tucked under the driver's seat. It's more for peace of mind than anything else. Discretion's the better part of valor, and I don't want to make a scene unless I absolutely have to. I'm used to being ready, always aware of what's around me. Before the pandemic, things were different. I'd park, then take transit or walk a few miles to the YMCA, spending the day bouncing around town. The van was never touched. Not once did anyone try to break in. I left the driver's door unlocked one night a couple years back when I just upgraded from my Tacoma, thinking maybe it was safe enough. I was having coffee in the back when some dude started rummaging around in the cab. I pulled the divider door back and caught him. He looked startled, mumbled some excuse, and peeled off. No violence, just a scare. But the pandemic changed a lot. The neighborhood got quieter in some ways and rougher in others. I started noticing more attempts to jimmy the door locks with screwdrivers. Most times they didn't get in, but it meant more days without my van, waiting at the shop for repairs. This summer, at a trailhead near MLK Shoreline, they finally popped a door and hit me for a few grand in tools, clothes, my phone. That was the only time since 2013 I've been hit successfully, and it stings, but I've learned to adjust and lock down the interior better. My bed's on the driver's side, which in hindsight was a dumb move. Coming from a public lands dirtbag lifestyle where you park and sleep quick and light, I didn't think about the city rhythms, the risks of that side facing the street. Next build, I'll change that. But for now, that's what I got. I avoid taking the van into San Francisco much. It's not just unfamiliar territory. Break-ins seem way more common there. The rhythm of Oakland is different, rougher, but it's home in a way. Pre-pandemic, I could use the Y for showers, laundry, and just a place to reset. That's been harder since, so I lean on friends, using their showers, doing laundry at their places. Baby wipes and good merino will help keep me clean enough between washes. I'm still a dirtbag, but a less offensive one. I like van life. It's the only way I can afford to live in the Bay Area without being crushed by rent. It's a grind, but it's mine. I know the contradictions of my situation. I'm a white dude living in a city with deep roots of radical politics. A city where so many black elders who built those traditions are dying in the streets. I try to honor that by being careful not to take up housing stock or space that should belong to others. I keep to my spot, keep to myself mostly. That winter, I decided I needed a break from the city. The neighborhood was getting sketchier at night, the break-in attempts more frequent, and the strain was getting to me. I had a couple days off, and a friend offered me access to a small, isolated cabin up in the Sierra foothills. The kind of place with no cell reception, no power except a wood stove, and miles of wilderness around. I figured the quiet would do me good. Something different than city sirens and the low hum of freeway traffic. I packed up what I needed, leaving most of my gear in the van, and headed out late afternoon. The drive was long but easy, winding through familiar roads that led away from the city's grip into a quieter, darker place. The cabin was tiny, nothing fancy, but solid. Old wood and stone with a porch that looked out over dense trees. The air smelled sharp and clean, cold in the way that winter woods are. Inside, the wood stove was already burning, a dry crackle filling the room with a steady warmth. I unpacked my small bag, clothes, some canned food, a thermos of coffee, and settled in. No Wi-Fi, no phone signal, just silence, the occasional creak of the old cabin settling in the cold, and the distant sounds of the forest. That first night was peaceful in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. No city noises, no strangers walking past my van, no worries about someone trying to break in. I slept soundly, waking only once to adjust the stove. The next day, I hiked some nearby trails, boots crunching on frost-covered leaves, the sky clear and sharp. The woods were alive but quiet, birds calling, the wind whispering through the branches. I felt good, like I'd stepped out of the noise and pressure of the city and back into something simple and real. But as night fell again, something shifted. I was sitting on the porch, sipping coffee, watching the last light fade behind the trees. The silence was so thick, it almost felt like it was watching me back. I caught a movement out of the corner of my eye, something low and quick slipping behind a tree. Probably a deer or some small animal, nothing unusual. Still, I felt a pull of unease. The woods were beautiful, but they weren't forgiving. Inside, I locked the cabin door tight and checked the windows. The stove was going strong, the fire casting flickering shadows. I tried to shake the feeling that someone or something was watching from the dark, but I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks, city nerves still tangled with wilderness instincts. That night, I didn't sleep well. The cold creaks of the cabin, the occasional snap of a branch outside, kept me half awake. I kept the crowbar I'd brought with me close by, even though I hoped I wouldn't need it. The next morning, I went outside to get firewood. The frost was thick on the ground, the air crisp and biting. As I stepped down from the porch, I noticed something that hadn't been there before. A footprint in the snow near the edge of the trees. Big, heavy, not like any animal I knew. My stomach tightened. Whoever or whatever had left that print was close. I checked around the perimeter of the cabin carefully, but found no other signs. No broken branches, no other tracks. It was like someone had come close but didn't linger. I wanted to brush it off, tell myself I'd imagined it or that it was an odd animal track, but I couldn't. The feeling that I wasn't alone in those woods was growing stronger. The day passed slowly. I stayed close to the cabin, not wanting to wander too far. I kept the fire going, the crowbar within reach. The silence was oppressive now, the woods around me a tight ring of shadows and quiet. Late afternoon, I spotted something else. A broken branch on the path that led down from the cabin, snapped at a height too low for an animal. Someone had been moving through the woods, close. I considered packing up and heading back, but the roads were icy and the sun was dipping fast. I decided to wait it out until morning, hoping daylight would bring some safety. That night was worse. The sounds outside grew louder. Twigs snapping, low rustling, like footsteps circling. I could hear the crunch of dry leaves just beyond the edge of the clearing. I sat in the dark, listening, heart pounding. The cabin felt smaller, the walls closing in. I kept the crowbar close, gripping it tight. I didn't want to look out the windows, but I couldn't stop myself. Something moved past the porch, just beyond the firelight. A shadow slipping between trees. No words, no noises beyond the small sounds of movement. I told myself to stay calm, to stay quiet, to be ready. The hours crawled by. Finally, just before dawn, the noises stopped. The woods fell back into silence. I waited until first light before I dared step outside. The tracks were there again, heavy footprints circling the cabin, sometimes close to the windows. They hadn't been here to chat or threaten. They were marking territory, sending a message I couldn't ignore. I gathered my things, packed fast and efficient. My hands trembled more than I liked to admit. I kept the crowbar close, ready to defend myself if needed. The drive back to Oakland was tense. Every bump in the road, every shadow on the highway felt like it might be waiting for me. I didn't stop until I was back in the neighborhood, the familiar sounds of the city filling the air. When I pulled into my usual parking spot, I locked every door and bolted the interior locks twice over. The city didn't feel as safe as before, but it was better than the woods that had nearly swallowed me whole. I learned a lot from that trip, about trust, about caution, and about how quickly the wilderness can turn from peace to threat when someone else decides you're trespassing. Living on the edge, whether it's a forest cabin or a van parked on an Oakland street, means keeping your guard up. Not just from nature, but from people who see your space as theirs to invade. Since then, I've stayed closer to the city, keeping my circle tight, my lock secure, and my crowbar within reach. The cabin taught me that sometimes the scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters. The night we nearly lost our minds out at the family cabin is something I'll never forget. It's been years, but I still get chills just thinking about it. I want to tell it all exactly as it happened. No glossing over, no exaggeration, just what it was like to be right there, trapped in that dark, silent hell in the middle of nowhere. Our family's property is huge, about 100 acres of thick forest and rolling hills in rural Georgia. We've had it for decades. In the very heart of it sits the hunting cabin. It's nothing fancy, just a rough, off-grid wooden shack right next to a slow river that snakes through the property. No neighbors for miles. No roads but the dirt path we've all known since childhood. We keep the entrance secured with a massive I-beam gate that only our family knows how to open. Around the property, you sometimes spot wildlife. A black bear here, a coyote there, but nothing that's ever really scared us. This land has always felt safe, if a little isolated. That night started out like any other weekend at the cabin. My cousin and I had driven out Friday afternoon, hauling a cooler full of beers and some groceries. The drive down the narrow dirt trail always feels like stepping into a different world. leaving the hum of cell towers and cars behind and entering complete silence and the scent of pine and damp earth. The cabin itself is modest. Rough cedar walls, a metal roof, a porch that creaks underfoot, and windows that never quite seal right. We set up our sleeping bags on the loft floor above the main room, cracked open some beers, and started a game of cribbage. The fire was roaring in the stone fireplace, casting warm, flickering shadows on the walls. We played music quietly from a small Bluetooth speaker, the crackling fire and the soft thump of country rock filling the room. The air inside smelled like smoked wood, old leather, and the faint trace of cold beer. It was a cold night for mid-fall, the kind where the temperature drops fast after dark. The windows were frosted just enough to hint at the bite outside. We joked about how rare it was to see temperatures near the low 20s, but honestly, it just made the fire feel that much better. We were getting ready to call it a night around midnight, both feeling that comfortable tiredness that comes from hiking and fresh air. My cousin was shuffling the deck for the last round when it happened. From the back of the cabin, an explosive pounding shattered the quiet. The sound wasn't just loud, it was violent. The metal door and window frames rattled violently as if something huge was trying to force its way in. Vam, vam, wham, asterisk, each hit like the blow of a battering ram, booming through the cabin. I remember freezing immediately, the cards slipping from my cousin's hands as we both turned our eyes toward the back door in horror. The windows rattled so hard the glass threatened to shatter. The banging kept going for a good 10 seconds, pounding like the woods themselves were trying to break through. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the banging stopped. The silence that followed was so complete it felt unnatural. No frogs croaking, no crickets chirping, no rustle of leaves or animal calls from the woods. Even the crackling fire seemed quieter, as if it was holding its breath with us. The air inside the cabin felt thicker, colder. We didn't move. My cousin quickly muted the music. We just stared at the back door, barely daring to breathe. For what felt like forever, maybe 5 or 10 minutes, the cabin was wrapped in this unnatural silence. Then, very slowly, the sounds of the woods started to come back. At first, just a faint rustle here and there, the occasional bird call, the distant buzz of a night insect. We stayed completely still until it felt a little safer. I finally gathered the nerve to walk over to the window beside the back door and shine my flashlight out into the woods. The beam cut through the thick darkness, illuminating twisted branches, thick underbrush, and tall trees that seemed to stretch forever. There was nothing there. My cousin whispered that he thought he'd seen a pair of eyes reflecting the light from deeper in the woods, but I didn't see anything. It was probably just a trick of the light, our brains trying to make sense of the sudden terror. We double-checked all the locks on the doors and windows, making sure everything was secure. The metal back door had obvious dents where it had been hit. One spot looked like it was starting to bend away from the frame, and the wooden jamb was cracked in places. We realized we'd have to replace that door frame soon. With no cell service or any way to call for help, we had only a pocket knife between us. We grabbed some flashlights and climbed up to the loft, the only safe place in the cabin with a solid door we could close. We sat there for the rest of the night, waiting, listening. Neither of us slept. We could hear the wind outside gently moving the trees and the occasional call of a distant owl. But nothing else. No footsteps, no banging, no strange sounds. Just the empty dark woods and the cold river running nearby. When the sun finally started to rise, we felt like we'd survived some kind of nightmare. We got down from the loft, surveyed the damage, and wasted no time packing up. The dents in the door were a harsh reminder that whatever had been out there had been close. Too close. We didn't speak much on the way back, just drove the long dirt road out of the property as fast as we could. When we finally got to a place with cell service, we called other family members to tell them what happened. Everyone was just as confused as we were. No signs of anyone or anything else on the cameras we keep at the gate. No reports of anyone trespassing. The thing is, it didn't feel like an animal. Bears can be destructive, sure, but the force of those blows was too precise, too strong. And animals don't stop suddenly and disappear into unnatural silence. We both felt like something was watching us, testing us, maybe even trying to scare us off. We replaced the door frame a week later, boarding up the cabin tighter than ever. We haven't gone back alone since, always bringing extra people and some kind of protection. To this day, we have no clear explanation for what happened that night. We have theories, of course. Maybe someone found the property and was trying to break in, maybe some drunk hunter or trespasser, but the silence afterward makes it hard to believe it was just people. Whatever it was close enough to almost get in. And that's a feeling I never want to experience again. That night changed how we think about that cabin and the woods around it. The property feels different now, more like a place where you need to stay alert and cautious, not a safe retreat from the world. Even after all these years, when I close my eyes, I can still see the back door shaking from the pounding, hear the echo of those heavy blows, and feel that terrible silence that followed, like the forest itself had gone dead in warning. That's the kind of fear you never forget.